What would you do if you passed the same mile marker 3 times on a straight highway, even though your odometer showed you'd driven 40 miles forward? What if you picked up a stranded motorist on a freezing night, only to wake up hours later standing on the roadside yourself, watching them drive away in your car? What if your radio started broadcasting news from tomorrow, including a fatal accident at the exact spot you're approaching right now? Tonight, we're diving into 11 deeply disturbing encounters that happened on America's most isolated backroads, places where the rules of reality don't seem to apply, where helpful strangers might not be what they seem, and where taking a wrong turn can trap you in something far worse than being lost. These are the roads most people speed through without a second thought. But for the people in tonight's stories, they became gateways to experiences that shattered everything they thought they knew about the world. I'm your host at Verified Fears, and before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and have those notifications turned on, because you're not going to want to miss what happens on these haunted highways. And horror family, I need to know, have any of you experienced something unexplainable on a lonely road? Drop your stories in the comments, because some of you might recognize these locations. Let's get into it. My name is Daniel Garrett, and I've been hauling freight across the Southwest for 22 years, which means I've driven every major route and back highway from California to Texas more times than I can count. And in all those years, in all those miles, I never once believed in anything I couldn't explain until March of 2019, when I took a run down what used to be called Highway 666 in New Mexico, the stretch they renamed Route 491 back in 2003 because too many people were complaining about the number. I picked up a load in Cortez, Colorado, around 11 at night, heading south toward Gallup, and the dispatcher told me it was a straightforward run, maybe 3 hours if I kept a steady pace. And I remember thinking it would be an easy night because I knew that road like the back of my hand. Flat, straight, hardly any traffic after dark. Just endless stretches of high desert with the Navajo Nation spreading out on both sides, and the occasional trading post or settlement breaking up the emptiness. The first hour was exactly what I expected. My headlights cutting through the darkness while the radio played old country stations that faded in and out. And I passed through Shiprock without incident, that massive volcanic rock formation rising up like a stone ship against the stars, sacred to the Navajo and visible for miles in every direction. And I remember checking my fuel gauge and seeing I had 3/4 of a tank, plenty to get me to Gallup, and my odometer read 127,745 miles, a number I only remember because of what happened next. About 40 miles south of Shiprock, I passed mile marker 87, which put me right on schedule. And I glanced at my trip odometer out of habit, seeing it click over to 43 miles since I'd left Cortez, and I settled back into that zone every long-haul driver knows, that state where you're alert but your mind drifts a little, watching the white lines disappear under your hood in an endless rhythm. And then maybe 10 minutes later, I saw mile marker 87 again. At first, I figured I'd just zoned out and misread it the first time. Easy to do on these empty highways where every marker looks the same. But something about it bothered me because I knew I hadn't passed any turnoffs or crossroads. Hadn't made any turns at all. Just straight south like always. So I shook it off and kept driving, watching the odometer now, watching it climb to 44 miles, then 45, then 46, and the road stayed perfectly straight ahead of me. No curves, no hills. Just that endless black ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon with nothing but scrub brush and darkness on either side. When I passed mile marker 87 for the third time, my whole body went cold despite the heater running full blast, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd been driving for nearly an hour since I first saw that marker, had burned through at least 40 miles of fuel and road. But somehow, I was back at the exact same spot. And the really terrifying thing was that the road never curved, never looped back, never gave me any chance to accidentally circle around. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19, calling out to anyone who might be listening, saying I was southbound on 491 near mile marker 87 and asking if anyone else was experiencing anything strange. But all I got back was static. That deep, crackling nothing that filled the cab and made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. And when I checked my cell phone, it showed no signal, which wasn't unusual out there in the nation. But the time on the screen said 1:47 a.m., which meant I'd been driving for almost 3 hours, but had somehow made no progress at all. I decided to stop, pulling over onto the shoulder and putting the rig in park. And I sat there with the engine idling, trying to calm my breathing and figure out what the hell was happening. And that's when I noticed the other vehicles. They appeared in my mirrors first, headlights approaching from behind. And I felt a wave of relief because it meant I wasn't alone out here. But as the first car passed me, an old Chevy sedan from the 1970s or 80s based on the body style, I realized the driver wasn't looking at me. Wasn't looking at anything, really, just staring straight ahead with both hands on the wheel. And in the brief moment when the headlights illuminated the interior, I saw that the driver's eyes were open, but completely blank, like there was nobody home behind them. 3 more vehicles passed me in the next few minutes, all of them older models. A Ford pickup from the 80s, a station wagon that looked even older, and a small compact car I didn't recognize, and every single driver had that same vacant expression, that same 1,000-yard stare into nothing. And none of them had passengers, just lone drivers heading south into the darkness. And I realized I hadn't seen a single vehicle since I'd passed through Shiprock, not until now, not until I'd entered this impossible loop. I got back on the CB and tried every channel. And on channel 9, the emergency channel, I finally picked up something, a voice crackling through the static, a man saying, "Requesting assistance, mile marker 74, multiple vehicle collision. We need ambulances immediately." And he sounded panicked and desperate. And I tried to respond, tried to tell him I'd help, but he couldn't hear me. Just kept repeating the same message over and over. And then I heard a woman's voice cut in, saying, "This is Unit 12. We're en route to mile marker 74, ETA 15 minutes. And the man responded with relief in his voice, thanking her. And then the whole conversation started over again, word for word, like a recording playing on loop. And I checked the date on my CB display, and it showed March 18, 1982. Which was impossible because it was 2019, and that date was set automatically by the system. I threw the rig into gear and floored it, watching my speedometer climb to 75, then 80, well over the posted limit, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get out of this stretch of road. Needed to see something different, some sign that I was making progress. And I kept my eyes locked on the mile markers now, watching for 88, for 89, for anything that would tell me I was moving forward. And when I passed mile marker 87 for the 4th time, I actually screamed, slamming my fist against the steering wheel hard enough to hurt, and my odometer now read 127,152, meaning I'd driven 107 miles since leaving Cortez, but was still at the exact same spot, still trapped in this impossible geography where distance had become meaningless. The sun should have been coming up by now. I'd been driving for over 4 hours, but when I looked east toward where the horizon should have been lightening with dawn, there was only the same deep darkness, the same star-filled sky that never changed. And I realized that time itself had stopped making sense, that I was stuck in some kind of loop where movement and time and distance were all broken, all disconnected from any kind of reality I understood. And the worst part was the other vehicles kept passing me, those ghostly drivers with their empty eyes. And I started recognizing them, started seeing the same Chevy sedan pass me every 20 minutes, the same Ford pickup, the same station wagon. And I understood that they were trapped too, that they'd been driving this loop for God knows how long, maybe since 1982, maybe longer. Just circling endlessly through the night on a highway that refused to let them reach their destinations. I tried everything I could think of, tried turning around and heading north. But within minutes, I was passing mile marker 87 again, coming from the opposite direction, tried pulling off onto the shoulder and waiting to see if daylight would come. But after sitting there for what my phone claimed was an hour, the sky stayed exactly the same shade of black, tried even closing my eyes and just driving blind for a few minutes, thinking maybe if I stopped watching the markers they'd change. But when I opened my eyes, I was right back at 87, and I started to break down, started crying behind the wheel because I was going to die out here. Was going to end up like those other drivers, empty-eyed and trapped forever. And my fuel gauge was dropping steadily now, down to a quarter tank, then an eighth. And I knew that when it hit empty, I'd be stuck here permanently. Another ghost vehicle adding to the collection. That's when I remembered something an old Navajo man had told me years ago at a trading post near Shiprock. Something about how some places aren't meant for outsiders. How the land itself has power and memory, and can trap people who disrespect it or who travel at the wrong times. And he'd specifically mentioned Highway 66, said the old number had attracted bad energy, had created a kind of wound in the landscape that never fully healed even after they changed the designation, and I'd laughed it off at the time, figured it was just local superstition. But now I was living inside that superstition, and it was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. In desperation, I started talking out loud, addressing the road itself, the land, the darkness, whatever force was holding me here. And I said I meant no disrespect, that I was just trying to make a living, trying to get home to my family. And I promised that if I got out of this, I'd never drive this route at night again, would tell everyone I knew to avoid it. And I don't know if it was coincidence or if something actually heard me. But when I passed the next mile marker, it read 88, and I nearly collapsed with relief. Watching as 89 appeared, then 90, then 91, and the other vehicles disappeared from my mirrors like they'd never been there. And my CB radio crackled back to life with normal chatter. Truckers talking about weather and way stations and truck stops, and my cell phone suddenly showed full signal. And when I looked east, I could see the very first hints of dawn touching the horizon, that pale gray that comes before sunrise. I made it to Gallup just after 6 in the morning, my fuel gauge on empty, and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. And when I checked my trip odometer, it showed 184 miles from Cortez, which should have been impossible because that drive is only about 110 miles. But somehow I'd driven an extra 74 miles, the exact number from that CB emergency call I'd heard. And I pulled into the first truck stop I saw and just sat there in the parking lot for an hour, trying to process what had happened, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But I knew better, knew what I'd experienced was real. I reported it to my dispatcher, told him everything, and he was quiet for a long time before saying other drivers had reported strange things on that stretch of road over the years. Time discrepancies, mile markers that didn't match up, vehicles that appeared and disappeared. But nobody talked about it much because they didn't want people thinking they were crazy or unsafe to drive. And he suggested I take a few days off, get some rest, and I did. But I never took another run on Route 491, never drove through that section of New Mexico again. And to this day, I don't know what I encountered out there on what used to be Highway 66. Whether it was something supernatural or some kind of dimensional fold, or just a place where the normal rules don't apply. But I know I'm lucky to have escaped, and I know those other drivers, those empty-eyed people in their decades-old vehicles, are still out there, still circling through that endless night, still trying to reach destinations they'll never see. And every time I talk to another driver who mentions taking that route after dark, I tell them the same thing. Don't. Because some roads don't just take you from one place to another. Some roads take you somewhere you were never meant to go. And if you're not careful, they never let you leave. If you've ever driven Route 491 through New Mexico late at night and experienced anything you couldn't explain, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because you're part of something bigger than you realize. And horror family, I need to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments if you've ever been trapped on a road that refused to let you go. This happened to me on February 11th, 2021. And I'm only now able to talk about it without feeling like I'm losing my mind all over again. So please just hear me out, because I know how insane this sounds. But I swear on everything I love that every word is true. My name is Briella. I'm a registered nurse at Great Falls Clinic, and I work the night shift in the emergency department, which means I'm used to weird hours and driving home in the dark. And I've always been the type of person who helps others when they're in trouble, because that's literally what I do for a living. So when I saw someone standing on the shoulder of Route 2 at 3 in the morning during a blizzard, I didn't even hesitate to pull over. It was negative 15 degrees that night, wind chill making it feel closer to negative 30. And the snow was coming down so thick, my wipers could barely keep up. And I'd just finished a 12-hour shift dealing with frostbite cases and hypothermia victims. So when I saw this figure hunched against the cold, about 30 miles east of Great Falls near the Black Horse Lake area, every instinct I had screamed at me to stop. The person was wearing what looked like a light jacket, completely inadequate for the weather, and they were just standing there next to a car with its hazards on, steam rising from under the hood. And as I pulled up behind them and put on my own flashers, I could see it was a man, maybe in his 40s, average build, dark hair. Nothing particularly memorable about him, except for the fact that he looked absolutely frozen. I rolled down my window and called out, asking if he needed help. And he walked up to my passenger side, and I unlocked the door because what else was I going to do? Leave him to freeze to death? He got in without saying much, just a quiet thank you. And I noticed his hands were shaking badly. His lips had that bluish tint that comes right before serious hypothermia sets in. And I immediately cranked the heat up higher and told him I'd drive him to the next town where we could call a tow truck. And he nodded, still not really making eye contact. And I remember thinking he was probably embarrassed about breaking down in such terrible conditions. We drove in silence for maybe 5 minutes, the only sounds being the heater blasting and the wind howling outside, and I kept glancing over at him to make sure he was okay, watching for signs of confusion or loss of consciousness that would indicate his core temperature had dropped too dangerously low. But he just sat there staring straight ahead through the windshield at the tunnel of white created by my headlights cutting through the snow. I tried making conversation, asked him his name, where he was heading, how long he'd been stuck out there. But his answers were vague and quiet, mumbled words I could barely hear over the storm. And something about his voice bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was just the cold affecting his speech. And I focused back on the road because visibility was getting worse, and I needed to concentrate on staying between the lines. The next thing I remember clearly is feeling incredibly drowsy. which was strange because I'd been wired from the shift, pumped full of coffee and adrenaline like always. But suddenly my eyelids felt like lead weights, and my thoughts started getting fuzzy and disconnected. And I remember thinking I should pull over before I fell asleep at the wheel. But my body wouldn't respond to what my brain was telling it to do. And the last thing I saw before everything went black was the man turning to look at me for the first time. And his eyes weren't right. Weren't human eyes at all, but something older and colder and completely empty. When I came to, I was standing on the side of Route 2 in the blizzard. Snow piling up on my shoulders, my scrubs soaked through and ice forming in my hair, and I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. And the cold hit me all at once, like jumping into Arctic water. That shock that makes your lungs seize up and your skin feel like it's burning. My car was nowhere in sight, just empty highway stretching in both directions, and I started screaming for help, but my voice got swallowed by the wind, and I could feel panic rising in my chest because I knew I was going to die out here. Knew that at these temperatures, I had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia would make me too confused to save myself. I started walking, had no idea which direction I should go, but standing still meant death. And my mind was racing, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember driving, trying to remember anything after picking up that man. But there was just a blank space where those memories should have been. Like someone had taken an eraser to that section of my brain. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, I saw headlights approaching, and I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms desperately. And a semi-truck slowed down and stopped. And the driver jumped out asking if I was okay. And I tried to explain, but I was shaking so hard I could barely form words. And he wrapped me in an emergency blanket and helped me into the cab and immediately radioed for help. The police found my car about 40 miles west of where the trucker picked me up, heading in the opposite direction from where I should have been going. And when they searched it, they found things that didn't belong to me. A man's wallet with an ID for someone named Cassius Porter, a pair of work gloves in the passenger seat, a travel mug of coffee that was still warm, and a phone that wasn't mine, locked with a passcode I didn't know. My purse was gone, my phone was gone, my nursing badge was gone, and when they checked the GPS history in the car, it showed I'd driven over 100 miles in what should have been impossible based on the timeline, showing stops at locations I'd never been to and routes that made no logical sense. The officer who questioned me kept asking the same things over and over. Where had I been? Who had I been with? Why had I been driving west when my home was east? And I kept telling him about the man I'd picked up, about the blizzard and the broken-down car and the feeling of losing consciousness. But when they went back to look for the disabled vehicle I'd seen, there was nothing there. No car, no tire tracks, no evidence anyone had been stranded at that location. They ran the name Cassius Porter through their system and found he'd been reported missing 3 years earlier, disappeared without a trace while driving Route 2 during a winter storm, last seen at a gas station near Black Horse Lake, and his car had never been found. And when they showed me his photo from the missing person report, it was him. It was the exact man I'd picked up. But he'd been missing since 2018, and I'd picked him up in 2021. The worst part, the part that still makes me sick to think about, is that I started finding evidence that I'd lived a completely different life during those missing hours. That phone they found in my car had texts from numbers I didn't recognize. People calling me by the wrong name, making references to conversations I'd never had and places I'd never been. And the wallet belonging to Cassius had recent receipts in it, dated just hours before they found my car, receipts for gas stations and convenience stores along routes I had no memory of driving. My bank account showed transactions I didn't make, purchases at locations I'd never visited, and security footage from a truck stop showed someone who looked exactly like me pumping gas and paying inside. But I could see in the footage that something was wrong with the way I moved, the way I held my body, like someone else was wearing me like a costume and hadn't quite figured out how to make it look natural. I went back to work after a week, tried to pretend everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely myself anymore, that something had been taken from me and something else had been left behind. And sometimes I'd catch myself doing things I didn't remember deciding to do, finding myself in rooms with no recollection of walking there, or hearing my own voice say words I didn't consciously choose. Other nurses started commenting that I seemed different, that my mannerisms had changed, that I moved differently or held my head at a different angle. And one of my closest friends pulled me aside and asked me point blank if I was okay, because she said it felt like she was talking to a stranger wearing my face. I started having dreams. Or maybe they were memories. I honestly can't tell the difference anymore. Where I'm driving through the blizzard, but I'm not me. I'm seeing through someone else's eyes. Someone who's been driving this same stretch of road for years, decades maybe. Picking up stranded motorists and trading places with them, taking their lives and leaving them with nothing. And in these dreams, I can feel a desperate hunger, an overwhelming need to be someone else, anyone else. Because being what I really am is unbearable. I found myself driving Route 2 again a few weeks later with no memory of getting in my car or deciding to go there, and I was heading west toward Black Horse Lake. And when I snapped back to awareness, I was pulling over for someone standing on the shoulder, a young woman who looked cold and scared, and my hand was reaching for the unlock button on my passenger door, and I physically had to force myself to drive away, had to fight against something inside me that wanted to stop, wanted to let her in, wanted to complete the exchange. I reported everything to the police, told them about Cassius Porter, told them I thought something was using Route 2 to trap people and swap identities with them, and I could see in their eyes they thought I was having a breakdown, thought the hypothermia had caused brain damage, or that I was suffering from some kind of dissociative episode. And maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy, but I don't think so. I found old newspaper articles going back to the 1970s about disappearances along Route 2, about people found wandering in the snow with no memory of who they were or where they'd been, about cars discovered abandoned with personal belongings from multiple different people inside, and about drivers who made it home but whose families swore they weren't the same person anymore, that something fundamental had changed, that the person they loved was gone, and a stranger had taken their place. I put in for a transfer to a different hospital, moved to Billings to get away from that stretch of highway, and I haven't driven through that area since. But sometimes late at night, I still feel that pull, that urge to get in my car and head back to Route 2, to find someone stranded in the cold and finish what was started. And the scariest part is, I don't know if those urges are coming from me or from whatever piece of Cassius Porter is still inside me, wearing my life like he wore the lives of everyone else he stole from. And I don't know if I'm really Briella anymore, or if I'm just what's left after the exchange. If you've ever picked up a hitchhiker on a lonely road in the middle of winter and felt strange afterward, felt like something inside you changed, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears and Horror Family. I need to know I'm not alone in this. Drop your stories in the comments if you've ever felt like you woke up as someone else. Listen, I need you to understand something right from the start, because what I'm about to tell you defies every logical explanation I've tried to come up with over the past 4 years. And believe me, I've spent countless sleepless nights trying to rationalize what happened on the Dalton Highway in January 2021. My name is Zachariah. I've been driving freight to the Prudhoe Bay oil fields for 6 years. And before that night, I would have told you I'd seen everything this brutal stretch of Alaskan wilderness had to throw at me. The whiteouts that reduce visibility to nothing. The temperatures that drop to 50 below. The isolation so complete you can drive 200 miles without seeing another human being. But I was wrong because I hadn't seen anything yet. I left Fairbanks on January 23rd around noon with a full load of drilling equipment headed north. The weather forecast was clear for once, which should have been my first warning because nothing ever goes smoothly on the Dalton. And I made good time through Livengood and up past the Yukon River crossing, the afternoon sun hanging low and weak in the sky, like it didn't really want to be there. By the time I reached Coldfoot, it was getting dark. That early winter darkness that swallows everything by 4 in the afternoon. And I stopped to fuel up and grab coffee because I knew the next stretch was the hardest part of the drive. Over 200 miles of nothing between Coldfoot and Deadhorse, with exactly 0 services, 0 cell reception, 0 margin for error. And if you broke down out there in winter, you were looking at death within hours if help didn't arrive. I pulled out of Coldfoot around 5:30 with a full tank, 800 miles of range if I was careful. More than enough to make it to Deadhorse, even accounting for the fuel-hungry conditions of winter driving. And I settled into that meditative state you need for the Dalton. Total focus on the road because one mistake, one moment of inattention, and you're in the ditch or worse. The miles rolled by slowly, my headlights cutting through the darkness and picking out the reflective markers along the roadside. The pipeline running parallel to the highway like a metal companion, and I was making good progress until around mile 175 when my low fuel warning light came on. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds, thinking it had to be a malfunction because I'd only driven about 100 miles from Coldfoot, should have had plenty of fuel left. But when I checked the gauge, it was sitting just above empty, and my heart sank into my stomach because this was exactly the kind of situation that killed people up here. I grabbed my radio and tried calling for help, but got nothing except static. Tried my satellite phone, which usually worked even in the deep wilderness, but couldn't get a signal. And I started doing calculations in my head, figuring I maybe had 20 miles of fuel left. Definitely not enough to make it to Deadhorse. Not even close to enough to make it back to Coldfoot. And the temperature outside was 42 below 0, which meant if I had to abandon the truck and try to walk, I'd be dead in less than an hour. I kept driving, watching that fuel gauge drop lower and lower, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. And I was starting to accept that I was probably going to die out here when I came around a curve and saw lights ahead, actual electric lights glowing warm and yellow against the darkness. And there, sitting on the side of the highway, was a truck stop. A full-service facility with pumps and a building and vehicles parked outside. And I nearly cried with relief. I pulled in slowly, my truck coughing and sputtering on the last fumes of diesel. And I sat there for a moment, just staring at this place. Because something about it felt off, but I couldn't quite identify what. Maybe it was that the building looked too clean, too well maintained for somewhere this remote. Or that the other vehicles in the lot were a strange mix of older trucks and cars that seemed out of place. But I was too grateful to be alive to question it too deeply. The pumps were old-style mechanical ones, the kind you don't see much anymore. And when I got out of my truck, the cold hit me like a physical blow. That brutal Alaskan cold that makes your lungs hurt and freezes the moisture in your nose instantly. And I fumbled with the pump handle with my thick gloves, watching the numbers roll over as diesel flowed into my tank. A man came out of the building, an older guy maybe in his 60s with a weathered face and a thick parka. And he walked over to me and said something about how I'd cut it close, how I was lucky to have made it here at all, and I agreed. Told him my fuel gauge must have been broken because I shouldn't have been running this low. And he just nodded like he'd heard that story before and said I should come inside and warm up while the tank filled. The interior of the building was like stepping back in time. Everything looked like it was from the 1970s or 80s. Wood-paneled walls and old vinyl booths, and a counter with a cash register that had actual physical buttons. And there were maybe half a dozen people inside. Truckers, mostly based on their appearance, sitting at tables drinking coffee and eating. And they all looked up when I walked in, but didn't say anything, just watched me with these strange expressions I couldn't quite read. I ordered coffee from the woman behind the counter. A middle-aged lady with tired eyes and a friendly smile. And she poured me a cup from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there for hours. And when I asked her how long this place had been here, she got this odd look on her face and said it had been here as long as she could remember, that travelers had been stopping here for decades. I sat down at the counter and drank the coffee, which was terrible but warm. And I started noticing details that bothered me. Like how none of the other customers were talking to each other. They were just sitting silently with their food and drinks. And how when I looked out the window at the parking lot, the vehicles seemed to shimmer slightly like heat waves, except it was 40 below outside, and how there was absolutely no sound except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. No kitchen noises. No music, no ambient noise of any kind. The woman asked me where I was headed, and I told her Dead Horse, and she got this sad look and said I should be careful on that last stretch, that a lot of folks don't make it, that sometimes people stop here and decide not to leave. And the way she said it made my skin crawl because it sounded less like a warning and more like an invitation. I finished my coffee quickly and told her I needed to get back on the road, and when I asked what I owed her, she just shook her head and said it was on the house, that anyone who made it this far deserved a break. And I tried to insist on paying, but she refused. And all the while, those other customers just kept staring at me with those empty expressions that reminded me of mannequins. I went back outside, and my truck was fully fueled. The pump had shut off automatically, and I climbed back into the cab and started the engine and got back onto the highway, checking my mirrors and seeing the lights of the truck stop receding behind me. And I felt this overwhelming sense of relief to be moving again, to be putting distance between myself and that strange place. I made it to Dead Horse around 3 in the morning, delivered my load, and the first thing I did was ask the dispatcher about that truck stop, told him exactly where it was located, around mile 175 between Coldfoot and Dead Horse. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said there was no truck stop there, that there were exactly 2 service stations on the entire Dalton Highway, and both of them were way south of where I was describing. I insisted, told him I'd just been there, had fueled up there, had gone inside and talked to people. But he pulled up maps and satellite images and showed me that stretch of highway, and there was nothing there. Just empty tundra and mountains. No buildings, no infrastructure, nothing. And he suggested maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe I'd hallucinated from exhaustion or hypothermia. I tried to convince myself he was right, that I'd somehow made it to one of the legitimate service stations and gotten confused about the location. But I knew what I'd experienced, knew the exact mile marker where I'd pulled off. And more importantly, when I checked my fuel receipts, there was nothing. No record of any purchase, no transaction on my fleet card, nothing to prove I'd stopped anywhere at all. But my tank was full, and I'd driven on that fuel all the way to Dead Horse. I started asking other drivers about it, casually bringing it up in conversations at truck stops and rest areas, and most of them looked at me like I was crazy, but a few got these knowing looks in their eyes. And one old-timer pulled me aside and told me I wasn't the first person to find that place. That stories had been circulating for years about a phantom truck stop that appeared to drivers who were about to run out of fuel. And he said the people who stopped there made it out fine, but the ones who went inside and stayed too long, who accepted the invitation to rest, were never seen again. I went back up the Dalton 3 weeks later on another haul, and I made sure to note my exact fuel consumption, kept meticulous records of every mile driven, and when I got to mile 175, I slowed down and looked for any sign of that truck stop, any indication that something had been there. But there was nothing. Just the same empty landscape I'd driven past dozens of times before. And my fuel gauge showed exactly what it should have shown. No mysterious depletion, no warning lights, nothing wrong at all. 6 months after that, I heard about a driver who'd gone missing on the Dalton. A guy named Soren, who'd been hauling the same route I did. And they found his truck parked on the side of the highway around mile 175 with the engine still running and the cab still warm, but no sign of the driver. And when they checked his fuel tank, it was completely empty, even though his last known stop had been Coldfoot just an hour earlier with a full tank. And they searched for weeks, but never found any trace of him. I think about that place almost every day. Think about those people sitting in those booths with their empty eyes and their silence. Think about how the woman behind the counter looked at me with sadness when she told me some folks decide not to leave. And I wonder if Soren walked into that same building and accepted whatever offer they made him. If he's sitting in one of those vinyl booths right now, drinking endless cups of bad coffee and waiting for the next desperate driver to pull into the lot. I still drive the Dalton because it's my job, and I'm good at it. But I never let my fuel get below half a tank on that stretch between Coldfoot and Dead Horse. Never put myself in a position where I might need to accept help from something that shouldn't exist. And every time I pass mile 175, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my foot on the gas, and I don't look to see if there are lights in the darkness because I'm terrified of what I might see. Or worse, what might see me. The Dalton Highway is the loneliest road in America. Over 400 miles of brutal wilderness where humans are barely tolerated and death waits for any mistake. But the truly terrifying thing isn't the cold or the isolation. It's knowing that somewhere out there in that frozen darkness is a place that exists outside the normal world. A place that offers salvation to the desperate and hopeless. And all you have to do is walk through the door and let it keep you forever. Horror family, if any of you drive these remote northern highways, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears and drop your stories in the comments if you've ever found help in a place that shouldn't exist. The date was August 14th, 2022. And we were 3 hours into what was supposed to be a fun family road trip across Nevada's Highway 50, that famous stretch they call the loneliest road in America. And my wife Lana had been excited about this drive for months, had researched all the ghost towns and historic sites, had packed snacks and games for our 2 kids, and everything was going perfectly until the radio started telling us we were going to die. My name is Ford. I'm an accountant from Sacramento, and I need to tell you this story because I don't know if we actually changed our fate that day, or if we're still living in some kind of borrowed time that shouldn't exist. We'd left Fallon that morning, heading east toward Austin through that endless basin and range landscape where mountains rise up from flat desert valleys like islands in a sea of sagebrush, and the sky stretches so wide and empty it makes you feel microscopic. Our son Louis was 8. Our daughter Peyton was 6. And they'd been great in the car. playing games and looking out the windows at the alien landscape. And Lana was reading aloud from a guidebook about the Pony Express stations that used to dot this route back in the 1860s. The radio had been cycling through static mostly, picking up nothing but occasional fragments of country stations from Reno or Salt Lake City. But around mile marker 112, somewhere in the middle of absolutely nowhere with nothing visible in any direction except desert and distant mountains, it suddenly locked onto a crystal clear signal. The voice that came through was a news broadcaster, professional and calm, and he was saying something about a serious accident on Highway 50 near Austin. And I almost changed the station because we didn't need to hear about traffic problems. But then he said the names. He said that a silver Honda Pilot with California plates had been involved in a single vehicle rollover at mile marker 136, that there were 4 occupants, 2 adults and 2 children, that emergency responders were on scene but casualties were reported. And then he gave our names, said Ford and Lana, and he gave our kids' full names. And the timestamp he was giving for the accident was 2:47 p.m. And when I looked at the clock on the dashboard, it was 11:23 a.m. Lana grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt, her fingernails digging into my skin. And I could see in the rearview mirror that Louis had gone completely white, and Peyton was starting to cry. And the broadcaster kept talking, describing our vehicle in perfect detail, giving the exact license plate number, saying that witnesses reported the vehicle had swerved suddenly, as if avoiding something in the road. And I felt ice water flooding through my veins because he was describing something that hadn't happened yet. Something that was apparently going to happen in 3 hours and 24 minutes. I tried changing the station, but every single frequency had the same broadcast. The same calm professional voice describing our deaths, describing the response efforts, describing how the Nevada Highway Patrol was investigating what had caused the accident. And then he started giving updates, saying that one of the children had been airlifted to Reno but wasn't expected to survive. And Lana made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Something between a scream and a sob. And I pulled over onto the shoulder because my hands were shaking too badly to drive. We sat there with the engine idling and the radio continuing its impossible broadcast. And I tried my phone, but there was no signal out here. Tried the GPS, but it was just showing our current location on Highway 50 with no explanation for what we were hearing. And Louis asked in this small, scared voice if we were going to die. And I didn't know what to tell him. Because how do you explain to an 8-year-old that you're somehow receiving news from the future about your own deaths? The logical part of my brain was screaming that this had to be a hoax, some kind of sick prank or elaborate technical glitch. But they'd said our names, our exact names, our license plate, descriptions of all 4 of us. And the broadcaster was now interviewing what he claimed was a Nevada Highway Patrol officer who was talking about the scene, about the scattered belongings, about how the vehicle had rolled multiple times. And I thought I was going to be sick. Lana was the one who finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. And she said, "We should turn around, go back to Fallon, cancel the trip." But then the broadcast changed, and the reporter was saying that some family members had been contacted, that our parents were being notified. And he gave the names of our parents. And he mentioned that we'd been traveling from Fallon, heading east toward Ely. And I realized that turning back might not save us, because whatever was going to cause the accident at mile marker 136 had already been set in motion somehow. I started driving again, slowly. My eyes locked on the odometer, watching the miles tick by. And we passed mile marker 115, then 116, then 117, and the broadcast was still going. Now playing interviews with people who claimed to have known us. Neighbors and co-workers saying what a tragedy it was, what a wonderful family we were. And it was surreal and horrifying to hear yourself being eulogized while you're still alive and listening. Peyton kept asking questions we couldn't answer, and Louis had put his headphones on. But I could see he was crying, and every mile we drove closer to 136 felt like moving toward an execution. But the road was arrow straight and empty. Nothing that looked dangerous. No other vehicles, no obstacles, just endless desert and the white stripe of asphalt stretching to the horizon. At mile marker 130, I slowed to a crawl, maybe 20 miles an hour, and Lana was gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were bone white. And the radio was giving minute-by-minute updates now, describing the exact time of impact, the trajectory of the rollover, the final resting position of the vehicle. And it was describing things in such specific detail that there was no way it could be fake. No way someone could have invented all these particulars. Mile marker 131 passed, then 132, and I was barely moving now. 10 miles an hour with my hazard lights on, scanning the road's surface for any defect or obstacle that might cause us to swerve. But there was nothing. Just perfect asphalt baking in the August sun. And then, at mile marker 133, the broadcast said something that made my blood freeze. The reporter said that investigators believed the family had been trying to avoid the accident after somehow receiving advance warning that they'd been driving unusually slowly and cautiously, but that it hadn't mattered, that the accident had occurred anyway at the exact predicted time and location. That's when I understood we were trapped in some kind of predetermined loop, that trying to avoid our fate was actually part of the pattern that led to it. And I felt this crushing despair because what do you do when the future is already written and you're being given a preview of your own deaths? Mile marker 134 appeared, and Lana started praying, actually praying aloud, which she hadn't done in years. And I was doing calculations in my head, figuring that if I stayed at 10 miles an hour, it would take me 12 minutes to reach mile marker 136. And it was now 2:35 p.m., which meant we'd still be at or near the fatal spot at 2:47, still inside the window when the accident was supposed to occur. At mile marker 135, I made a decision that felt completely insane. I pulled off the road entirely, drove out into the desert scrub, bouncing over rocks and sagebrush. And I took us maybe a quarter mile from the highway. And I stopped and turned off the engine. And I said we were going to wait here until the danger passed, until 247 came and went, and proved that the broadcast was wrong. We sat in silence in the brutal heat with the air conditioning off to conserve the battery, watching the clock on the dashboard count down the minutes. And the radio was still broadcasting, but fainter now. The signal breaking up, and it was describing the scene at mile marker 136, describing the debris field, describing emergency vehicles arriving. And at 2:46, Peyton asked if we could please leave now, said she didn't like it here, and I told her one more minute, just one more minute, and we'd know we were safe. At exactly 2:47 p.m. we heard it, a sound that came from the direction of the highway. A terrible, crashing, metallic sound that echoed across the desert. And I looked at Lana, and she looked at me, and we both knew what we'd heard. And I started the engine and drove back toward Highway 50. And when we reached the road at mile marker 136, there was wreckage. A silver Honda Pilot, identical to ours, was lying on its roof, windows shattered, fluids leaking onto the asphalt. And there were no other vehicles around, no explanation for how it had gotten there. And when I got out to look closer, my legs almost gave out because the license plate was mine, was our number. And there was a child's backpack in the dirt that looked exactly like Louis's. And Lana was screaming now, pulling the kids back toward our car, which was somehow still intact, still sitting where I'd parked it off the road. I don't know how long we stood there staring at the wreckage of our own vehicle, at the impossible duplicate of our lives scattered across the highway. But eventually Lana said we needed to leave, needed to get away from this place, and I agreed. And we got back in our car and I drove. Drove fast, drove without stopping until we reached Ely an hour later. And the whole time the radio was silent, just static. No more broadcasts from the future. We checked into a motel and I called the Nevada Highway Patrol from the room phone, reported the accident at mile marker 136, and the dispatcher said they'd send someone to investigate. And 2 hours later, an officer called me back and said they'd found the wreckage of a Honda Pilot at that location. But it had been there for years based on the weathering and rust. That it appeared to have been from an accident that occurred in 2019, 3 years before our trip. And when they ran the plates, the vehicle had been reported as totaled in an accident that killed all 4 occupants, a family matching our description with names eerily similar to ours. We never finished that road trip. Drove straight home the next day, taking I-80 instead. And we've never spoken about it to anyone except each other. Never tried to explain what happened because there is no explanation that makes sense. Sometimes I think we died at mile marker 136, and everything since then has been some kind of afterlife we don't recognize. And sometimes I think we somehow split off into a parallel timeline where we survived. And sometimes I think that wrecked vehicle was always there, and the radio broadcast was a warning from ourselves in another reality, where we didn't stop in time. The only thing I know for certain is that we heard our own deaths announced before they happened. And somehow by hearing them, we managed to not be there when they occurred. And I don't know if that means we cheated fate or if fate was never as fixed as the broadcast made it seem. Horror family. If you've ever received a warning about something before it happened, if you've ever heard news from the future or seen yourself in a place you hadn't reached yet, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears. And please drop your stories in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else has experienced this impossible loop of time folding back on itself. I ride a Harley-Davidson Street Glide, and I've spent the last 5 years documenting motorcycle trips across America for my YouTube channel, which means I've ridden through just about every type of weather and terrain you can imagine. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on the Blue Ridge Parkway in October of 2023, when I drove into a fog that shouldn't have existed and came out the other side with evidence of something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. My name is Kason, and I need to get this story out because I've been carrying it alone for too long. And maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can help me understand what the hell I encountered up there in those ancient mountains. I'd planned this trip for weeks, timing it for peak fall foliage, and the forecast had been perfect. Clear skies and mild temperatures. Ideal riding conditions for the winding roads through the Blue Ridge. I started early that morning from Waynesboro, heading south on the Parkway with my helmet cam recording like always. And for the first 2 hours, everything was spectacular. Those legendary mountain views with valleys full of red and gold leaves. The kind of scenery that makes you feel grateful to be alive. Around mile marker 63, somewhere between Humpback Rocks and the Yankee Horse Ridge area, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly on my bike's display, going from a comfortable 58 degrees down to 42 in just a few minutes. And then I saw it ahead. A wall of fog that looked completely out of place, given the clear conditions everywhere else. It wasn't the normal morning mist you see in mountain valleys. This was thick and gray and seemed to have a texture to it, like it was made of something heavier than water vapor. And it stretched across the entire parkway, completely blocking the road ahead. I slowed down as I approached it, considered turning around because riding a motorcycle in heavy fog is dangerous as hell. But I could see on my GPS that it was only about a 3-mile stretch before the road curved east where conditions should clear up. So I made the decision to continue, dropping my speed to maybe 15 miles an hour. and I entered that fog bank expecting it to be cold and damp like fog normally is, but instead it felt warm, almost body temperature, and it pressed against me from all sides like something alive. Visibility dropped to almost nothing immediately. I could barely see 5 feet in front of my bike, could barely make out the yellow center line on the road, and the fog seemed to muffle all sound in this weird way, where even my engine noise sounded distant and wrong. I kept my eyes locked on that center line, using it to guide me, and I noticed my helmet cam's recording light was flickering, which it had never done before, and my GPS screen was glitching, showing my position jumping around randomly like the satellites couldn't track me properly. That's when I started feeling the pressure. It came from all sides at once, like invisible hands pressing against my jacket, my arms, my legs, and at first I thought it was just the wind behaving strangely in the fog. But there was no wind. The air was completely still, and the pressure was increasing, getting stronger. And I could feel distinct points of contact, like fingers or palms pushing against me. My speedometer was showing 12 miles an hour, but it felt like I was moving through something thick, like the fog itself had resistance. And I had to twist the throttle harder just to maintain that crawling pace. Then I heard the sounds. They started as whispers, voices that seemed to come from inside the fog itself, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in this overlapping murmur that I couldn't quite make out individual words from. And the pressure against my body intensified, became almost violent, like something was trying to push me off the bike. I gripped the handlebars tighter, leaned forward, and shouted into my helmet for whatever this was to back off. And for just a second, the pressure released. But then it came back twice as strong, and I felt something cold and wet streak across my visor, leaving a mark that looked like a handprint. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I considered stopping, considered just sitting there and waiting for the fog to lift. But some instinct told me that stopping would be worse, that whatever was in this fog wanted me to stop, wanted me to stay. And if I did, I might never leave. So I kept moving, kept that bike rolling forward no matter how hard the invisible pressure pushed against me. And the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I started to make out words, fragments of sentences, people saying help me and don't leave and stay here and it's cold. And I realized I was hearing voices of people who were lost, people who were trapped somehow in this impossible fog. Oh, the temperature display on my bike was going haywire, jumping from 40 degrees to 70 to 30, numbers changing every few seconds like it couldn't decide what the actual temperature was. And my fuel gauge dropped from 3/4 to half in the span of maybe 2 minutes, which made no sense given how slowly I was moving. I could feel things touching my back now. Hands, definitely hands, pressing against my jacket, some of them gentle like they were just resting there. Others aggressive, pushing, grabbing. And when I reached back with one hand to brush them away, I felt nothing. Just empty air. But the sensation of being touched didn't stop. Something streaked across my left mirror, and I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing at the edge of the road. But when I turned my head, there was nothing there except more fog. Then another figure appeared on the right side, this one closer, and I could see it was a person, or the shape of a person, standing perfectly still just off the shoulder. And as I passed, I saw more of them. Dozens of them, these shadowy human-shaped forms standing in the fog, all facing the road, all perfectly motionless, and none of them had features, just dark silhouettes against the gray. I twisted the throttle harder, pushing my speed up to 20 miles an hour despite the terrible visibility. And the pressure against me became crushing, like being squeezed by something enormous. My bike started to wobble. the front wheel fighting me, and I had to use all my strength to keep it upright and moving forward. The voices were shouting now. No longer whispers, but full-volume screams, hundreds of voices all crying out at once, and I couldn't understand most of what they were saying. But I heard my name, heard Kaysen repeated over and over, which was impossible because nothing in this fog should know who I was. My GPS showed I'd been in the fog for 20 minutes, which couldn't be right, because at my speed, I should have covered the 3-mile section in less than 10 minutes. And I started to panic, started to think I was trapped in some kind of loop, that I'd been driving through this fog for longer than I realized and might never find the other side. The figures at the roadside were getting closer, pressing in toward the pavement, and some of them were reaching out toward me as I passed. And I saw hands, dozens of pale hands stretching through the fog, grasping at empty air inches from my bike. Then something grabbed my left handlebar. I felt it clearly, felt fingers wrap around the grip and pull, trying to steer me off the road, and I fought it. Yanked the handlebar back to the right, overcorrected, almost laid the bike down, caught it at the last second, and the grip released. My visor was completely covered in handprints now, on the inside and the outside, which should have been impossible because I hadn't opened it. And I could barely see through the smeared marks that looked like someone with wet palms had pressed their hands against the plastic over and over. I was praying, actually praying for the first time since I was a kid, just repeating, "Please let me out. Please let me through." And maybe something heard me, or maybe I just finally reached the edge. But the fog started to thin, started to break apart into wisps, and I saw sunlight ahead, actual clear golden sunlight, and I gunned the throttle and burst out of that fog bank doing 40 miles an hour. And the second I crossed the threshold into clear air, everything stopped. The pressure vanished, the voices cut off mid-scream, and the temperature jumped back up to 58 degrees. I pulled over at the first overlook I found, killed the engine, got off the bike, and my legs almost gave out. I was shaking that badly. I pulled off my helmet and looked at it, and the visor was covered in handprints. Dozens of them, small ones and large ones, overlapping and smeared. And when I looked at my jacket, I saw the same thing. Handprints all over the leather, on my back, my arms, my chest. Everywhere those invisible presences had been touching me. My helmet cam had recorded the entire encounter, or at least I thought it had. But when I checked the footage later that night in my motel room, the recording was corrupted for the exact section where I'd been in the fog. The video showed me entering the fog bank, then static and glitching for what the timestamp showed was 23 minutes. Then me emerging on the other side, no footage of what happened in between, no evidence of the voices or the pressure or the figures except for the audio, which was a nightmare of overlapping screams and whispers that I could barely stand to listen to. But the handprints were real. They were visible on my helmet and jacket, and I took dozens of photos of them before I tried to clean them off. And that's when I discovered they wouldn't come off easily. The marks weren't moisture or dirt or anything physical. They looked like they'd been burned or etched into the surface somehow. Lighter colored patches in the exact shape of human hands, and no amount of scrubbing would completely remove them. I started researching the Blue Ridge Parkway after that, looking for any similar reports, and I found scattered accounts going back decades, hikers and drivers talking about strange fog that appeared without weather conditions to support it, about feeling presences in the mist, about hearing voices. But most people dismissed these stories as folklore or imagination. I found references to disappeared persons in that section of the Parkway, people who'd gone for walks or rides and were never found. And I started wondering if those voices I'd heard were them, if somehow they'd gotten trapped in that fog and couldn't get out. The worst part came 2 weeks later when I was going through my photos from the trip. And I found images on my camera I didn't remember taking, photos that must have been captured during the fog encounter, even though I never touched my camera during that time. They showed the road from my perspective on the bike, showed the fog thick around me, and in several of the images there were figures visible, those same shadowy forms I'd seen at the roadside. But in these photos, they were clearer, detailed enough that I could see they were wearing old-fashioned clothes, styles from different eras, from the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And in one photo, there was a figure standing directly in front of my bike, close enough that I should have hit them. And their face was visible. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, with hollow eyes and an expression of desperate sadness. I reported it to the Park Service, sent them copies of the photos and the audio recording, told them there was something dangerous on that section of the Parkway. But I never heard back except for a form letter thanking me for my concern. I've ridden the Blue Ridge Parkway twice since then. But I've avoided that section between mile markers 60 and 65, taken alternate routes, because I'm terrified of what might happen if I enter that fog a second time, terrified that the next time those hands might not let me go. The handprints on my helmet are still visible, faint but definitely there. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I think I can hear whispers. Voices calling my name, telling me to come back, telling me they're still waiting in the fog. I don't know what that place is. If it's some kind of dimensional fold or a trap for human consciousness or something else entirely. But I know it's real. Know that there are people stuck there, and I don't know if they're dead or alive or something in between. Horror family. If you've ever driven or ridden through the Blue Ridge Mountains and encountered fog that felt wrong, that pressed against you like something alive, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because this is bigger than just my story. Drop your encounters in the comments, especially if you've been on that section of the Parkway, because I need to know how many others have felt those hands. How many others have heard those voices begging for help from inside a fog that shouldn't exist. I sell medical equipment to rural hospitals and clinics across the Southwest, which means I spend about 60% of my life driving between small towns that most people have never heard of. The job requires long hours on empty highways, driving through the night to make morning appointments, and I've gotten used to the solitude, even come to enjoy it in a strange way. But after what happened on Highway 12 in Utah last April, I can't drive at night anymore without constantly checking my mirrors, without that crawling sensation on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched. My name is Soren, and this is the story of the night I was followed by something that shouldn't have been possible, something that knew things about me it had no right to know, and something that I'm terrified might still be out there waiting for me to come back. I'd left a meeting in Panguitch around 9 p.m. on April 17, 2024. Later than I'd planned, but the client had been chatty, and I didn't want to be rude. My next appointment was in Torrey the following morning, and the most direct route was Highway 12, that stunning scenic byway that winds through red rock country and over the Hogback Ridge. During the day, it's one of the most beautiful drives in America. But at night, it's just darkness and curves and the occasional deer in your headlights. The first 30 miles were uneventful. I had my playlist going, windows cracked to let in the cool desert air, and I was making good time through the darkness. The road was completely empty, not another vehicle in sight, which was normal for that time of night on a route that most tourists avoid after sunset. Around mile marker 47, somewhere between Escalante and Boulder, I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another driver heading the same direction, probably doing the same kind of late-night transit I was. But as the minutes passed and the miles rolled by, those headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind me, maybe a quarter-mile back, matching my speed perfectly. When I slowed down for curves, they slowed down. When I accelerated on straightaways, they accelerated. I tried speeding up to 70 on a long straight section, and the distance remained constant. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Highway 12 through that section is twisty and technical, with steep drop-offs and no guardrails in many places. It's not the kind of road where you can just mindlessly match another driver's speed, especially in the dark. You need to pay attention to every curve, every grade change, every foot of asphalt. Yet this vehicle behind me was somehow maintaining perfect distance, regardless of how I varied my speed. I decided to test it. There was a pull-out coming up, one of those scenic overlook areas where tourists stop during the day to take photos. I put on my turn signal and pulled off, expecting the other vehicle to pass me and continue on. Instead, it slowed down and pulled into the same overlook, parking maybe 50 feet behind me, and my stomach dropped because this was no longer coincidence. I sat there with my engine running, watching in my mirrors as those headlights just stayed on, illuminating my car from behind. And I couldn't see anything beyond the glare, couldn't make out what kind of vehicle it was or if there was anyone in the driver's seat. My heart was pounding, and I considered getting out to confront whoever this was, to demand an explanation for why they were following me. But something held me back. Some instinct that told me approaching that vehicle would be a very bad idea. After maybe 2 minutes of this standoff, I put my car in gear and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating quickly. And in my mirror, I saw the other vehicle do the same, falling back into that exact same following distance. I tried to get a better look at it, tried to identify make or model. But the headlights were too bright and positioned at just the wrong angle, creating enough glare that I couldn't see any details of the vehicle itself. My phone had no signal out there, so calling for help wasn't an option. The next town was Boulder, still about 15 miles ahead, and I made the decision to drive straight there and pull into a gas station or somewhere with people and lights. I pushed my speed up to 75, faster than was safe on those curves, and the vehicle behind me matched it effortlessly. And I started to realize that whoever or whatever was driving that vehicle had skills that seemed almost superhuman. The way they were navigating that treacherous road in perfect synchronization with me. Then my radio, which had been playing music from my phone, suddenly switched on its own to AM and locked onto a station, and I heard a voice come through the speakers. A male voice that sounded oddly flat and emotionless, and he said my name. He said, "Soren, you need to pull over." And I nearly drove off the road in shock because there was no way, absolutely no way, that voice should know who I was. I reached for the radio to turn it off, but it wouldn't respond. The buttons did nothing, and the voice continued, saying, "Soren, we need you to stop the vehicle. This is important. You're not in danger if you cooperate." And the use of the word "we" made my blood run cold because it suggested multiple entities. And I looked in my mirror and saw that those headlights had gotten closer. We're now maybe 100 feet back, and I could see in the intense glare that there was definitely a vehicle there, but its shape seemed wrong somehow. Too low and too wide, like no car I'd ever seen before. The voice on the radio kept talking, kept using my name, and it started saying things it shouldn't have known. Personal things, mentioning my ex-wife's name, mentioning the town where I grew up, mentioning my daughter who I hadn't seen in 3 years because of a custody dispute, and it was asking me to pull over so we could talk about these things, so we could help me with my problems. And the way it phrased everything was wrong, like someone who'd learned about human emotions from a textbook, but didn't actually understand them. I was approaching the hogback now, that infamous section where the road narrows to a razor-thin ridge with 1,000-foot drop-offs on both sides. And I was doing 80 miles an hour, which was absolutely insane on that section. But I was more terrified of what was behind me than I was of going over the edge. The voice on the radio was getting more insistent, less friendly, saying I was making this difficult, and that I needed to comply with instructions. And the headlights behind me were getting brighter, so bright that I had to adjust my rearview mirror to reduce the glare. And I could feel heat coming from behind me. Actual physical heat, like those lights were putting out more than just visible light. Then something even stranger happened. My car started to slow down on its own. My foot was pressed all the way to the floor on the gas pedal, but my speedometer was dropping, going from 80 to 70 to 60, and the vehicle behind me was closing the distance rapidly, getting closer and closer. And I could see now that it definitely wasn't a normal car. The proportions were all wrong, and there seemed to be too many lights. More than just the standard 2 headlights, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at. The voice on the radio said, "Engine control override successful. Please remain calm." And I realized with absolute horror that whatever was behind me had somehow taken control of my vehicle, was remotely manipulating my car's systems, and I was about to be caught by something that was very clearly not human. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and pulled off the road onto a narrow dirt track that led down into a canyon, a service road, or maybe an old mining track, barely wide enough for my car and definitely not marked on any GPS. My car bounced and jolted over the rough terrain, scraping the undercarriage on rocks, and I turned off my headlights and just drove blind into the darkness, praying I wouldn't hit a tree or go over a cliff. And behind me, I saw those strange lights reach the turnoff, but they didn't follow. The vehicle just stopped at the edge of the dirt road, its lights pointing down into the canyon where I'd gone. And I kept driving deeper into the darkness until I couldn't see those lights anymore. I must have driven for 20 minutes on that dirt road, going maybe 10 miles an hour with no lights, using just the faint starlight to avoid the worst obstacles. And eventually, I came to a small clearing next to what looked like an abandoned mine shaft. And I parked and killed the engine and just sat there shaking. My radio had gone back to normal, playing my music like nothing had happened. And when I tried to check the settings, I couldn't find any AM stations. The radio claimed it only received FM, which I knew was wrong because I'd heard that voice clear as day. I waited in that clearing until dawn, maybe 4 hours, sitting in my locked car and watching the dirt road behind me for any sign of those lights. But nothing came. When the sun finally rose and I could see where I was, I discovered I'd driven down into a narrow canyon that the dirt road dead-ended in, and there was no way out except back the way I'd come. I had no choice but to drive back up to Highway 12, and when I reached the pavement, I saw something that made me question everything. There were tire marks on the shoulder where the vehicle had stopped, but they weren't normal tire tracks. The pattern was wrong, too symmetrical, with marks that suggested the vehicle had more than 4 wheels, and the pavement itself was scorched in places, like something hot had been resting on it. I took photos with my phone, dozens of them, documenting everything I could see before I got back in my car and drove to Boulder as fast as the road would allow. I reported it to the local sheriff's office, told them everything, showed them my photos. But I could see they thought I was either crazy or had been the victim of some elaborate prank. They said they'd send someone to look at the site, but I never heard back from them. My car, when I took it to a mechanic later that week, had unexplained damage to its computer systems. The diagnostic port showed evidence of an unauthorized connection, and the mechanic said someone had definitely interfaced with my vehicle's controls, but he couldn't explain how they'd done it wirelessly. The worst part came a month later when I was going through my phone's photo library and found images I didn't remember taking. Photos that must have been captured that night, even though I never touched my camera. They showed the view through my rear windshield, showed those strange lights behind me. And in several of the images, you could clearly see the vehicle, and it was like nothing I'd ever seen. Angular and metallic, with too many lights arranged in geometric patterns that seemed deliberately wrong, designed to be disturbing to human eyes. I don't drive Highway 12 at night anymore. I don't drive any empty highways at night anymore if I can help it. I've changed my routes, changed my schedule, even considered changing my job entirely, because I can't shake the feeling that whatever followed me that night is still out there. Still watching, still waiting for another opportunity. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, my radio will turn on by itself and I'll hear static, and buried in that static I'll hear my name, hear that same flat, emotionless voice saying, "Soren, we're still waiting. We still need to talk to you." And I have to unplug every electronic device in my home just to make it stop. I've researched similar encounters, found scattered reports online of people being followed by vehicles that don't behave normally, that seem to know things they shouldn't, that demonstrate technology that's beyond what should be commercially available. Most people dismiss these stories as hallucinations or hoaxes, but I know what I experienced was real. Know that something followed me through the Utah desert that night. Something that wanted me to stop and cooperate, and probably would have taken me somewhere I'd never return from. The photos I took are still on my phone, backed up in 3 different places, because they're the only proof I have that any of this happened. I've shown them to experts, to automotive engineers and technology specialists, and none of them can explain the vehicle in the images, can't identify the make or model, or even the basic configuration. One engineer told me it looked more like a drone than a car, something designed for remote operation rather than human occupancy. And that thought terrifies me even more than thinking it was driven by something inhuman, because it means there might have been operators somewhere watching me through cameras, studying me, deciding whether I was worth pursuing further. Horror family. If you've ever been followed on an empty highway by something that matched your every move, that knew things about you it shouldn't, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because these encounters are happening more frequently than anyone wants to admit. Drop your stories in the comments, especially if you've experienced vehicle-to-vehicle interference or heard voices through your radio that called you by name, because we need to document this pattern and figure out what these things want and why they're targeting people on isolated roads. We thought we were being spontaneous. My wife Mira and I had always talked about taking a real cross-country road trip, not one of those planned-out affairs with hotel reservations and itineraries, but the kind where you just drive and stop wherever looks interesting. So in November 2023, we loaded up our Subaru Outback and pointed it west from Phoenix with no destination in mind beyond somewhere in Nevada by tomorrow. I'm Zayden. I teach high school history, and Mira works as a graphic designer, which means we both appreciate good aesthetics and interesting stories. That combination nearly destroyed us on Highway 93. We left Phoenix around 2 in the afternoon, took I-17 north to connect with 93, and by the time we passed Wickenburg, the sun was starting to get low in that perfect golden hour way that makes the desert look like something from another planet. Mira was taking photos through the passenger window, excited about every cactus and rock formation. And I was enjoying the drive. Enjoying the feeling of having nowhere we needed to be, and all the time in the world to get there. Around 6 p.m., somewhere between Wiki Up and Nothing, which really is the name of an actual place on Route 93, we saw the turnoff. It wasn't marked with a big green highway sign like you'd expect, just a small wooden marker that said Ashford Historic Township, 3 miles. with an arrow pointing east onto a paved two-lane road that looked well-maintained. Mira immediately said we should check it out, that it might be one of those preserved old West towns like Tombstone or Jerome. And I agreed, because the road looked good, and we weren't in any hurry. The turn took us away from Highway 93 into desert that gradually shifted into low hills covered with creosote bushes and the occasional Joshua tree. The road curved gently through the landscape, well paved and marked with fresh yellow lines, which struck me as odd for a route to what was supposedly a historic site. But I didn't think too much about it at the time. After exactly 3 miles by the odometer, we crested a small rise, and there it was. A whole town spread out in a valley below us. And my first thought was how perfectly preserved everything looked. Ashford appeared to be a town from the 1950s, completely intact and seemingly operational. There were maybe 30 or 40 buildings arranged along a main street, including what looked like a diner, a gas station, a general store, a small hotel, and various other shops and houses. Cars were parked along the street, older models but not antiques, mostly sedans and station wagons from the 50s and 60s. And as we drove down into the valley, we could see people walking on the sidewalks, going about their business like this was a perfectly normal functioning town. "This is incredible," Mira said, already reaching for her camera. "It's like driving into a time capsule. Do you think it's some kind of living history exhibit?" I didn't answer because something was bothering me. Something I couldn't quite articulate. The town looked too perfect, too clean, like a movie set rather than an actual place where people lived. The buildings showed no wear, no weathering from decades of desert sun and wind. The cars looked freshly washed despite the dusty environment. And most disturbing, the people we could see on the street were all dressed in period-appropriate clothing, neat dresses and slacks and button-up shirts, like extras in a 1950s film. We parked on Main Street in front of the diner, which had a neon sign in the window that said, "Millie's Place, best coffee in Ashford." And as I turned off the engine, I noticed that our car was the only modern vehicle visible anywhere in town. Everything else was vintage, and I mean everything, from the streetlights to the mailboxes to the signs in the shop windows. "Should we go in?" Mira asked, gesturing toward the diner, and I could see people moving around inside through the large front windows. Customers at tables and a waitress carrying plates. We got out of the car and immediately noticed how quiet everything was. Not silent, but muted somehow, like the normal ambient sounds of a town were turned down to barely audible levels. I could hear a distant dog barking, could hear what might have been a radio playing somewhere, but it all sounded far away and slightly off, like we were listening to a recording rather than actual live sounds. A man walking past on the sidewalk nodded to us politely and said, "Afternoon, folks, welcome to Ashford," and kept walking. And there was something about his smile that made my skin crawl, too wide and too fixed, like he was performing the action of smiling rather than actually feeling the emotion. We walked into Millie's Place, and the bell above the door jingled. And a woman behind the counter looked up and gave us that same too perfect smile. And she said, "Well, hello there, strangers. Y'all just passing through or planning to stay a while?" The diner was full of customers, maybe 20 people spread across the booths and counter stools, and every single one of them turned to look at us when we entered. And every single one of them had that same fixed smile. That same slightly wrong expression that suggested they were mimicking human behavior rather than naturally exhibiting it. "Just passing through," I said, my voice sounding strange in the odd acoustics of the place. "We saw the sign for a historic township and thought we'd check it out." "Historic?" The waitress laughed, though the sound was hollow somehow. Well, I suppose we are at that, aren't we? Y'all take a seat anywhere you like. I'll be right with you. We slid into a booth near the window so we could keep an eye on our car, and Mira leaned across the table and whispered, "This place is weird, right? It's not just me." I shook my head, keeping my voice low. Everything about this is weird. The people, the way they're dressed, how perfect everything looks. I don't think this is a tourist attraction. I think this is something else. The waitress appeared at our table with menus, the kind of laminated single-page affairs that diners used to have, with prices that were shockingly low. Coffee for 15 cents and a full meal for under $2. What can I get you folks to drink? Actually, I said, we're just looking for some information. How long has Ashford been here? We couldn't find anything about it online before we came. Her smile never wavered. Oh, Ashford's been here forever, feels like. Nice, quiet little town, good people, everyone knows everyone. You're thinking about staying, aren't you? We've got rooms at the hotel, very reasonable rates, and folks who come here tend to find they don't want to leave. The way she said that last part made every nerve in my body scream danger. No, we need to keep moving. But thank you. We should actually get back on the road. I started to stand up, but Mira grabbed my arm, her eyes fixed on something outside the window. "Zayden, look at our car." I turned and felt my stomach drop. There were people gathered around our Subaru, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all dressed in that same 1950s style. And they were touching it, running their hands along the paint, peering through the windows. And their movements were synchronized in a way that was deeply unnatural, like they were all being controlled by the same puppeteer. "I think we need to leave right now," Mira whispered. And I nodded, and we both stood up and headed for the door, and the waitress called after us, "Y'all come back now, you hear? Ashford's always here, always waiting, always happy to welcome new residents." When we stepped outside, the people around our car didn't move away. They just turned to look at us with those empty smiles. And one of them, a man in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, said, "Beautiful vehicle you have here. So modern, so new. We don't get many visitors with cars like this. What year is it?" 2021, I said, moving toward the driver's door, and Mira was right beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. 2021, the man repeated. And all the others repeated it too, in perfect unison. 2021, 22 and 21, 22 and 21. Like they were tasting the words, trying to understand what they meant. I unlocked the car and we got in quickly, and I started the engine, and the people didn't try to stop us, but they didn't move away either. Just stood there surrounding the vehicle, their hands pressed against the windows and doors, and their faces were all turned toward us with those horrific smiles. And I could see now that their eyes were wrong. Too glassy, too reflective. Like doll eyes that caught the light in an inhuman way. I put the car in reverse and backed up slowly, forcing them to move. And as we pulled away from the curb, I saw more people emerging from buildings, dozens of them, all converging on Main Street, all turning to watch us leave. And Mira made a sound of pure terror and said, "Drive faster, please just drive faster." I accelerated up Main Street, heading back the way we'd come. And in my rearview mirror, I could see the townspeople standing in the middle of the road watching us, not waving goodbye, not moving at all, just standing there in a perfect line like they were posed for a photograph. We reached the edge of town and started up the hill toward the highway. And that's when I realized something was wrong. The road looked different than it had on the way in. The pavement was cracked now, the yellow lines were faded, and as we crested the rise where we'd first seen the town, I looked back and Ashford was gone. Not abandoned, not hidden by geography, just gone. The valley where the town had been was empty desert. Nothing but sand and rocks and scrub brush. No buildings, no roads, no sign that anything had ever been there. Mira was crying, making these small, terrified sounds. And I kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel. And when we reached Highway 93, I turned north and didn't slow down until we were 50 miles away. We stopped at a real town, a normal town with modern cars and regular people. And we went into a gas station, and I asked the attendant if he'd ever heard of a place called Ashford near Wickiup. He looked at me confused and said no. Said there was nothing out that way except empty desert. No towns for miles in any direction off Highway 93. And when I insisted, when I said we'd just been there, he got this uncomfortable expression and suggested maybe we were tired from driving, maybe we should rest before we continued. We checked into a motel that night, and I searched online for any reference to Ashford, Arizona, and found nothing. No historic records, no census data, no maps that showed a town by that name anywhere near where we'd been. Mira went through her camera and the photos she'd taken of our trip. And every picture from the time we turned off Highway 93 until we got back to the highway was corrupted, just gray static, like the files had been deliberately erased. But we both remembered it. Remembered every detail of that perfect 1950s town, remembered those smiling people with their wrong eyes and synchronized movements. And we remembered what the waitress had said about people not wanting to leave once they arrived. 2 weeks later, I was going through my wallet and found something that made me drop it like it was on fire. It was a business card, cream-colored and slightly yellowed with age, that said, Millie's Place, Ashford, Arizona, best coffee in town, with a phone number. And I don't know how it got there because I never took anything from that diner, never touched anything except the booth we sat in. I've kept that card, stored it in a plastic sleeve in a drawer in my office, because it's the only physical proof I have that Ashford exists, or existed, or exists in some way I can't understand. The phone number on the card doesn't work, the area code doesn't even exist. But I've called it anyway, multiple times, always hoping and dreading that someone might answer. We've driven Highway 93 a few times since then, have looked for that turnoff with a wooden sign, but we've never found it. The road just runs straight through empty desert, with no indication that there was ever anything there. No sign, no paved road leading east, nothing. But I know it's still there. Somehow, somewhere. That perfect preserved town full of people who smile too much and move in uncanny synchronization. And I know they're waiting for more visitors, more people to welcome and offer hospitality to. More people who might decide to stay forever in a place that shouldn't exist. Horror family, if you've ever found a town that wasn't on any map, that felt like it existed outside of normal time, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because these places are real, and they're hunting for new residents. Drop your stories in the comments, especially if you've been on Highway 93 between Phoenix and Las Vegas. Because I need to know if anyone else has found Ashford, and more importantly, if anyone who stayed there has ever made it back out. I work night shifts at a rural health clinic outside of Great Falls, which means I drive Highway 200 east toward my home in Lewistown 4 nights a week, usually leaving around midnight when my shift ends. It's not a glamorous job, and the commute is brutal, but the pay is decent and someone has to staff these remote facilities. For 3 years I made that drive without incident, without anything more interesting than the occasional deer or elk crossing the road. Then in March of 2024, I witnessed something that has made every single drive since then an exercise in controlled terror. My name is Lana. I'm a physician assistant. I deal in facts, in evidence-based medicine, in things that can be measured and verified. What I'm about to tell you contradicts everything I believe about how reality works. But I'm telling it anyway because if I don't get this out, if I don't share what I've seen, I think it might actually drive me insane. March 12th was a Tuesday. Unremarkable in every way. I'd had a quiet shift, treated a kid with an ear infection and an elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be heartburn. Did my paperwork, locked up the clinic, and headed home around 12:30 a.m. The weather was clear. Temperature in the low 30s, no wind, good visibility. Highway 200 through that section is straight and flat, cutting through ranch land and prairie that stretches to the horizon in every direction. About 45 minutes into my drive, near mile marker 92, I saw taillights ahead of me. Two vehicles looked like passenger cars based on the height of the lights, maybe half a mile up the road. I wasn't paying much attention to them, just noting their presence the way you do when you're driving, when suddenly a massive semi-truck appeared from the south. From a side road I knew existed, but rarely saw anyone use. The truck pulled onto Highway 200 directly into the path of the lead car. There was no way the car could avoid it. I watched the collision happen in slow motion, watched the car crumple against the front of the truck, watched both vehicles spin across the highway in a shower of sparks and debris. And the second car tried to swerve, but clipped the wreckage and flipped end over end before sliding into the ditch. I was already hitting my brakes and reaching for my phone to call 911, my medical training kicking in automatically, mentally preparing for mass casualty triage. I screeched to a stop maybe 200 feet from the accident scene and jumped out of my car, grabbing the emergency medical kit I always kept in my trunk. The smell hit me first. Burning rubber and metal and something chemical, maybe fuel or transmission fluid. I ran toward the wreckage, calling out to ask if anyone could hear me, and then I stopped dead because something was wrong with what I was seeing. There was no semi-truck. The two cars were destroyed, twisted metal and shattered glass spread across both lanes, and I could see bodies inside the vehicles. But the truck that had caused the accident was simply gone. Not driven away, not pulled off to the side, just gone like it had never existed. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds trying to process this, trying to understand where a 40-ton vehicle could have disappeared to on a flat, straight highway with nowhere to hide. And then my training overrode my confusion, and I ran to the nearest car. The driver was a woman in her 30s, unconscious, blood on her face, shallow breathing. The passenger was a man, also unconscious, worse injuries. The second vehicle had a single occupant, a young guy maybe 20 years old, and he was clearly dead. The steering column had crushed his chest. I called 911, reported the accident, started doing what I could for the survivors, and when the operator asked me what had happened, I said there had been a collision with a semi-truck, and she said, "What semi-truck? Are you saying it fled the scene?" And I realized I had no answer that made sense. I looked around at the wreckage, at the damage patterns, at the way the cars had been crushed and torn, and all of it was consistent with a high-speed collision with a much larger vehicle. But that vehicle wasn't there. The Montana Highway Patrol arrived within 20 minutes, ambulances right behind them, and I gave my statement to a trooper while the EMTs worked on the victims. I told him everything. Told him about the semi pulling out from the side road, about the collision, about how the truck had vanished. And he listened patiently and wrote it all down. And then he walked me back to the scene and pointed out something I hadn't noticed in my shock and adrenaline. There were no skid marks from a semi-truck. There were no debris from a semi-truck. There were no tire tracks, no oil stains, no physical evidence at all that a large truck had been involved. The damage to the passenger cars was severe. but the trooper said it could have been caused by the vehicles colliding with each other at high speed. Possibly the lead car braking suddenly and the second car rear-ending it, causing both to spin out. I insisted that wasn't what I'd seen, insisted I'd watched a semi-truck pull directly into traffic. But the evidence wasn't there. And the trooper got this uncomfortable look and asked if I'd been tired, if I'd maybe dozed off for a second and woke up to see the aftermath, my mind filling in an explanation that seemed to make sense. The woman from the first car died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The man survived, but with permanent disabilities. The young guy in the second car was pronounced dead at the scene. And I went home that morning feeling like I was losing my mind because I knew what I'd seen. But the physical evidence said it couldn't have happened. I researched that intersection, that side road where the semi had pulled from. It was County Road 247, a gravel track that led to a few ranch properties. I drove out there the next day and talked to the ranchers, asked if they'd heard or seen anything that night, if any large trucks used that road, and they all said no, said it was too rough for commercial vehicles, said nothing bigger than a pickup ever came down that way. 3 weeks later, I was making the same drive home. Different night, but same route. And near mile marker 92, I saw it again. Different vehicles this time, a pickup truck and an SUV. Same scenario. Semi-truck pulled out from County Road 247, T-boned the pickup, caused a chain reaction collision, and when I stopped and ran to help, the semi was gone and there was no evidence it had ever been there. 2 people died that night. 3 more were seriously injured. And I gave the same statement to the same trooper. And he looked at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion and suggested maybe I should take some time off, maybe see someone about stress management. But I couldn't stop driving that route, couldn't change my schedule without giving up my job, so I kept making that commute, and I kept seeing it happen. April 8th, 1 victim. May 3rd, 3 victims. May 29th, 2 victims. Always near mile marker 92. Always a semi-truck pulling from County Road 247. Always the truck vanishing before anyone else arrived. And always me as the only witness, the only person who saw the actual collision. Everyone else just seeing the aftermath. I started documenting everything. I set up a dashboard camera in my car, high quality, recording continuously. The next time I saw the accident happen, on June 11th, I was ready. I watched the semi pull out, watched the collision, watched people die. And I ran to help knowing my camera had captured everything, knowing I'd finally have proof. When I reviewed the footage later, I felt something break inside me. The video showed the highway ahead of me, showed the 2 cars driving normally, and then suddenly they were spinning out, colliding, destroying themselves. But there was no semi-truck visible in any frame. The cars appeared to be reacting to something, swerving and braking in response to an obstacle. But that obstacle wasn't there, wasn't visible, wasn't real. Except it was real. I'd seen it. And more importantly, people were dying. Real people with real families who showed up to real funerals. The accident reports all listed different causes, driver error or mechanical failure or unknown factors, but never mentioned a semi-truck because there was never any physical evidence of one. I started researching the history of that location, spending hours at the county library going through old newspapers and accident reports. That's when I found it. November 14th, 1994. A semi-truck carrying hazardous chemicals jackknifed at the intersection of Highway 200 and County Road 247. The driver, a man named Ronald Pratt, was killed instantly. The truck burned for hours, the chemicals inside creating toxic fumes that required evacuation of nearby ranches. 8 other vehicles were involved in the accident, 7 fatalities total. including the truck driver. The accident report described how the truck had pulled onto the highway without yielding directly into traffic, causing a massive pileup. The report noted that Pratt had been driving for 18 straight hours, was likely asleep at the wheel, never saw the vehicles he pulled in front of. The burn patterns from the chemical fire were so severe they had to replace the entire section of pavement, had to resurface that exact area where I kept seeing the phantom accidents. I cross-referenced the dates of every accident I'd witnessed with the calendar, looking for patterns, and I found one that made my blood run cold. Every single phantom accident I'd seen occurred exactly 30 years to the day after someone had died in the original 1994 crash. The woman who died on March 12, 2024? A woman named Patricia Flores had died on March 12, 1994, in that pileup. The young man, on March 28th, matched a victim from March 28, 1994. A secondary collision caused by the burning wreckage blocking the highway. The pattern was perfect, horrifically perfect. Every victim in the new accidents matched the circumstances of a victim in the old accident. And they were all dying in the same ways, crushed or burned or thrown from vehicles, as if the original accident was somehow replaying itself, jumping forward 30 years, using different people but following the same script. I tried to warn people. I filed reports with the highway patrol, with the county sheriff, with anyone who would listen, telling them that I could predict when and where these accidents would occur based on the 1994 records, begging them to set up roadblocks or warnings or something. But without physical evidence, without any way to prove a phantom truck was causing these collisions, there was nothing they could do. Some of them looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. One trooper suggested I might be so obsessed with the idea of the phantom truck that I was somehow causing the accidents myself, though he couldn't explain how. The last death in the original 1994 accident occurred on July 23rd. A motorcyclist who struck the debris field a week after the initial collision, went down at high speed, wasn't wearing a helmet. Which means on July 23rd, 2024, if the pattern holds, someone is going to die at mile marker 92. And I'm going to witness it, and I'm going to be helpless to stop it. I've considered not driving that route on that date. Considered calling in sick or taking vacation or just refusing to be there. But every time I think about it, I realize that if I'm not there to help, if I'm not there to call 911 and provide immediate medical care, the victims might suffer longer, might die slower, might have less chance of survival. I'm trapped in this loop, forced to bear witness to deaths that match patterns from 3 decades ago. Caused by a truck driver who died before most of my current co-workers were born. The dashboard camera footage sits on my computer. Dozens of accidents, all showing vehicles destroying themselves against invisible obstacles. I've sent copies to traffic safety researchers, to paranormal investigators, to anyone I think might take it seriously. But most people see it as proof that I'm not witnessing actual truck collisions, that I'm imagining the semi and the accidents are just ordinary crashes. But they're not ordinary. They follow a pattern too precise to be coincidence. They occur at the exact location where Ronald Pratt pulled his semi onto Highway 200 without looking, where 7 people died in flames and twisted metal. And they're killing people who match the victim profiles from 1994, as if the accident is stuck in some kind of temporal loop, replaying itself with new actors, but the same deadly script. Highway 200 near mile marker 92 looks like any other stretch of Montana prairie. Flat and empty and peaceful in the daylight. But at night, it becomes something else. Becomes a stage where the same tragedy plays out over and over. Where a truck that doesn't exist kills people who don't know they've been cast in a story that was written 30 years ago. Horror family. If you've ever witnessed an accident where the cause disappeared before anyone else arrived, where the evidence didn't match what you saw, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears, because this is happening more places than just Montana. Drop your stories in the comments, especially if you've seen phantom vehicles or witnessed accidents that repeat in patterns, because we need to understand what's happening and why the dead can't stop killing. October 2023. I'm driving alone through the Adirondacks at night, which looking back was probably my first mistake. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From before everything changed, from back when I still believed the world made sense. I'm Itzel. I'm 21 years old, a senior at SUNY Plattsburgh, and I was heading home for fall break, making the drive from campus down to my parents' place in Oneonta. The route takes you through some of the most isolated parts of upstate New York, through the Adirondack Park where the mountains press in close and the forests are so dense they block out the stars. Route 28 winds through this wilderness like a black ribbon, connecting tiny towns separated by miles of nothing but trees and darkness. I left campus later than I should have, around 8 p.m. on October 13th. Which meant I'd be driving the most remote sections well after midnight. My roommate told me to wait until morning, told me Route 28 through the mountains wasn't safe at night. But I was eager to get home, eager to see my family and sleep in my own bed. And I figured I'd driven that route dozens of times before, without incident. The first 2 hours were fine. I passed through Warrensburg and Indian Lake without problems, stopped for gas and coffee, sent my mom a text saying I'd be home by 2 a.m. Then I entered the real wilderness, that section between Indian Lake and Blue Mountain Lake, where the highway narrows and twists through forests so thick they feel like they're trying to swallow the road. My phone lost signal completely. The radio faded to static. I was alone with my headlights, cutting through darkness, so absolute it felt solid. Felt like something you could touch. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes through this section, my eyes locked on the white lines and the reflective markers, when I glanced in my rearview mirror to check if any cars were behind me. That's when I saw the child in my back seat. I screamed and jerked the wheel, nearly drove off the road, caught myself at the last second and managed to straighten out. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought I might have a heart attack right there. And I looked in the mirror again, and the child was still there, sitting directly behind me in the passenger side rear seat. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that reflected my dome light like an animal's eyes reflect headlights. I slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty highway, and I spun around in my seat to look directly at the back seat. And she was there. Solid and real and absolutely impossible because my car doors were locked and I'd been alone. And there was no way, no possible way a child could have gotten into my car. "Who are you?" My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the sound of my panicked breathing. "How did you get in here?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me with those reflective eyes, her expression completely blank, no fear, no curiosity, no emotion at all. She was wearing a dress that looked old-fashioned, something from decades ago, pale blue with a white collar, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. I reached for my door handle, thinking I'd get out and run. But my hand wouldn't move, wouldn't obey my brain's commands. And I realized with growing horror that I was paralyzed, locked in place by something I couldn't see or understand. The child tilted her head, studying me like I was an interesting specimen in a jar. And then she spoke. "Drive." Her voice was wrong, too deep for a child, layered with something else underneath, like multiple people speaking in imperfect unison. "You need to keep driving. We're not finished yet." "Please," I managed to force the word out through lips that barely wanted to move. Please let me go. I don't know who you are or what you want, but please just let me go. She smiled then, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. Too wide, showing too many teeth, stretching her face in ways that weren't quite human. Drive, Itzel? Drive, or we'll make you drive. Either way, we're continuing this journey together. She knew my name. This impossible child who'd appeared in my locked car knew my name, and the way she said it suggested she knew more than that, knew things about me that no stranger should know. My hands moved on their own, gripping the steering wheel. My foot pressed the accelerator without my conscious decision, and the car started moving forward down Route 28. And I was just a passenger in my own body, watching helplessly as something else controlled my movements. We drove like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Me locked in place behind the wheel. The child sitting in the back seat watching me with those animal eyes. I could see her clearly in the rearview mirror. Could see her chest rising and falling like she was breathing. But I had this terrible certainty that she wasn't alive, wasn't human, wasn't anything that belonged in the real world. Then she started aging. It happened gradually at first, her face becoming slightly older, moving from 5 or 6 to maybe 8 or 9, her hair growing longer, her dress changing style subtly. I watched in the mirror as she continued to age, becoming a teenager, then a young woman in her 20s, then middle-aged, then elderly, all in the space of maybe 5 minutes. And her expression never changed, never showed any reaction to this impossible transformation. Do you understand now? Her voice changed with each age, going from child to adult to elderly woman. Time is different for us. We experience it all at once, every moment happening simultaneously. You only see it linearly, 1 second after another, but we see the whole thread, from birth to death and back again. I wanted to ask what she meant by us, wanted to ask what she was, but my voice wouldn't work, my mouth wouldn't form words. The car kept driving at steady 55 miles per hour, my hands turning the wheel smoothly through each curve, my foot adjusting the gas pedal automatically, and I had no control over any of it. The child, or the thing that looked like a child, continued aging and de-aging in cycles now, moving from infant to elderly and back to infant in smooth transitions that made my brain hurt to watch. And as she changed, she started talking, started sharing information about my life that no one should have known. She told me about the time I was 7 and I lied to my parents about breaking my mother's favorite vase. Blamed it on our dog. She told me about my first kiss behind the gym at my high school when I was 15. She told me about the abortion I'd had when I was 19, the one I'd never discussed with anyone except the clinic staff and my ex-boyfriend. She told me about thoughts I'd had, private, terrible thoughts about people I loved, thoughts I'd never spoken aloud and never would. Every secret, every private moment, every hidden truth about my life came spilling out of this thing's mouth in that wrong layered voice. And I realized with absolute certainty that this entity had access to my entire existence, could see every moment I'd ever lived and maybe even moments I hadn't lived yet. We know you completely, Itzel, the thing said, its face cycling through ages as it spoke. We know everyone who drives this road, everyone who enters our territory. We collect you, study you, add you to our understanding of what it means to be human. And sometimes, when we find someone particularly interesting, we like to ride along, to experience your perspective, to feel what it's like to be trapped in linear time for just a little while. My car radio turned on by itself, cycling through static and fragments of voices, and I heard my own voice coming through the speakers, Heard myself talking to people I knew, conversations I'd had yesterday and last week and last year, all mixed together in a chaotic jumble. The thing was somehow broadcasting my memories through the radio, playing back my life like it was recorded audio. We passed through Blue Mountain Lake without stopping, the town's few lights sliding past in the darkness, and I prayed someone would see me, would notice something was wrong. But the streets were empty, and my car just kept driving south on Route 28 like nothing unusual was happening. The thing in my back seat started multiplying. I glanced in the mirror, and there were now 2 children, where there had been 1, then 3, then 4. All of them cycling through ages independently, creating this horrifying kaleidoscope of human life stages happening simultaneously. They started speaking in overlapping voices, each one sharing different secrets about me, different memories, different private thoughts, until the car was filled with this cacophony of my own life being recited back to me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. My hands were my own again. My foot responded to my commands. And I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. I spun around to look at the back seat, and it was empty. Completely empty. No children, no evidence anyone had been there. But the radio was still playing, still broadcasting fragments of my voice and my conversations. And when I tried to turn it off, if the controls didn't respond, I grabbed my phone to call for help and found hundreds of photos I didn't remember taking. Pictures of me sleeping, pictures of me driving, pictures taken from angles that suggested the camera had been floating around my car. And all of them were time-stamped from tonight. From the last hour. From the time the child had been in my back seat. I got out of the car and stood on the side of Route 28 in the freezing October air. And I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until my voice gave out. And the forest swallowed the sound without echo, and nothing answered except the wind in the trees. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my radio finally dead, and I arrived at my parents' house at 4:30 a.m., 2.5 hours later than I should have based on when I'd left the gas station. I couldn't account for that missing time. Had no memory of those hours except the 20 minutes with the child in my back seat, which meant there were over 2 hours I'd lost completely. 2 hours when something had control of me, and I have no idea what happened. My parents said I looked terrible, asked if I was sick, and I told them I was just tired from the drive. I went to my room and didn't come out for 18 hours. Sleeping a deep, dreamless sleep that felt more like unconsciousness than rest. When I finally checked my phone again, I found a video file I didn't remember recording. It showed the view from my phone's camera, pointed at me while I was driving, and I could see myself behind the wheel. But my eyes were closed. I was clearly asleep or unconscious. And the car was still moving, still navigating Route 28 perfectly. And in the back seat behind me, I could see dozens of figures, children and adults and elderly people, all crowded together, all staring at the camera, all smiling those 2 wide smiles. The video was 2 hours and 17 minutes long, exactly matching my missing time. I never drove Route 28 at night again. I changed my major, switched to online classes so I could live at home, never returned to Plattsburgh campus. My roommate called confused, asking why I'd disappeared, why I'd left all my stuff in our dorm room. And I couldn't explain it to her, couldn't make her understand that going back would mean driving that road again. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I drove Route 28 at night a second time, those things wouldn't just ride along, they'd keep me. Sometimes I still hear that voice, that wrong layered voice of the child who wasn't a child. And it's whispering secrets about my life, telling me things that haven't happened yet, future moments I'm supposedly going to experience. And I don't know if those are predictions or threats or promises. Don't know if my future is fixed or if knowing about it might change it. The photos and video are still on my phone, backed up in cloud storage, saved in 3 different locations because they're the only proof I have that I'm not insane. That something really did happen on Route 28 that October night. I've shown them to exactly 2 people, my boyfriend and my therapist, and both of them looked disturbed by what they saw, but neither could offer any explanation. Horror family. If you've ever had a passenger appear in your car who couldn't have been there, who knew things they shouldn't know, who aged and de-aged before your eyes, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears because these entities are real and they're collecting us. Drop your stories in the comments, especially if you've driven through the Adirondacks at night, because I need to know who else they've studied, who else they've ridden with, and if anyone who's been chosen by them has ever truly escaped. They call Highway 83 the road to nowhere. And after what I experienced last summer, I understand why that name is more literal than anyone wants to admit. I'm a landscape photographer, been doing this professionally for 8 years, and my specialty is capturing the overlooked beauty of America's flatlands, those places people drive through without really seeing. Kansas was supposed to be a 3-day project, documenting the endless horizons and big sky country. Instead, it became 3 hours that somehow stretched into something impossible, something that broke my understanding of how space and distance work. My name is Caspian. I shoot for National Geographic occasionally, sell prints through galleries in Chicago and Denver. And before July 2024, I would have told you I'd seen every variation of prairie landscape that existed. I was wrong. There are places in Kansas where the normal rules stop applying, where straight lines curve back on themselves in ways your eyes can't detect, but your soul knows are wrong. I started my shoot near the Nebraska border on July 19th, planning to drive south on Highway 83 through the heart of Kansas, stopping every 10 or 15 miles to capture the changing light and landscape. The highway through that section is famous for being one of the straightest roads in America. 60 miles of perfectly flat asphalt, cutting through wheat fields and grassland with barely a curve or hill to interrupt the geometry. The weather was perfect. That golden late afternoon light that photographers dream about. And I was making good progress, shooting from various angles, using my drone to get aerials. Around 5 p.m. I was near the town of Oakley, and I decided to do one more series before finding a motel for the night. I drove south, looking for the perfect spot, that place where the road and the landscape and the light all came together in a composition worth capturing. I found it at mile marker 127, where the highway stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line toward the horizon. Wheat fields on both sides, glowing gold in the slanting sun. I pulled onto the shoulder, set up my tripod, and started shooting. The light was changing fast, the way it does in that golden hour, and I was focused on getting the sequence right, bracketing exposures, switching lenses, completely absorbed in the technical work. After maybe 20 minutes, I packed up my gear, got back in my car, and continued south. I drove for what felt like 10 minutes, watching the odometer tick up, the road unchanging ahead of me. And then I saw something that made me tap my brakes in confusion. There, on the right shoulder, exactly where I'd just been set up, was my tripod. Still standing. Still positioned exactly where I'd left it 20 minutes and several miles ago. I pulled over again, got out, and walked to the tripod in a daze. It was definitely mine, had my camera plate still attached. And there on the ground next to it was my lens cap that I'd been looking for earlier. But I'd packed everything up I knew I had. I remembered loading the equipment into my car. And I'd driven several miles south. I'd watched the mile markers pass, a 128, 129, 130. And now somehow I was back at 127. I picked up the tripod and looked around, trying to understand what had happened. The landscape was identical in every direction. Same wheat fields, same flat horizon, same perfectly straight highway stretching north and south. No landmarks, no distinctive features, nothing that would let me orient myself or confirm where I actually was. I got back in my car and checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising out here in the middle of rural Kansas. My GPS showed me at mile marker 127 on Highway 83, exactly where I'd been 20 minutes ago. I checked my camera, scrolled through the photos I'd taken, and they were all there. Hundreds of images from this exact location, all time-stamped within the last half hour. Something was wrong with distance, with movement, with the way space was supposed to work. I put the car in drive and accelerated, watching my speedometer climb to 60 miles per hour, watching the white stripes disappear under my hood in their regular rhythm. And I focused on the mile markers, determined to watch them change, to confirm that I was actually moving forward. Mile marker 127 passed. Then, after what should have been a minute of driving at 60 miles per hour, covering a full mile of distance, I saw mile marker 127 again. Same post, same number, same exact location. I hadn't turned around, hadn't curved. The road had remained perfectly straight. But somehow I'd ended up back where I started. I tried again, this time keeping my eyes locked on the road ahead, looking for any sign of a curve or turn that might explain this loop. The highway remained arrow straight, a ruled line drawn across the landscape, and after another minute of driving, I passed mile marker 127 for the third time. The sun was getting lower now, the shadows lengthening, and I felt panic starting to build in my chest. I stopped the car and got out, stood in the middle of Highway 83, and looked in both directions. North and south, the road stretched to the horizon in perfect straight lines, and in the distance, I could see something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing on the road, maybe a quarter-mile south, just standing there, motionless, facing my direction. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to make out details. And then I realized there was another figure the same distance north, also standing motionless, also facing toward me. And as I continued to scan the horizon, I saw more of them. Figures spaced at regular intervals along the highway in both directions, all standing perfectly still, all watching. I got back in my car with shaking hands and locked the doors. And I made a decision that felt insane, but necessary. I turned around, pointed the car north instead of south, and drove. Maybe the loop only worked in one direction. Maybe going backward would let me escape this impossible geometry. The figures got closer as I approached them, and I could see now they weren't exactly human-shaped. They were too tall, too thin, with proportions that were subtly wrong. And they didn't move as I drove past them, didn't turn their heads or shift their position, just stood there like markers, like boundary posts defining some territory I couldn't perceive. Mile marker 127 appeared again. Fourth time, fifth time, sixth time. I was driving at 70 miles per hour now, burning through gas, my fuel gauge dropping steadily, and the sun was setting, the light fading to that deep gold that comes right before dusk. Except the sun wasn't moving. It hung in the same position in the sky, that perfect golden hour angle that should last maybe 30 minutes, but was stretching on and on, frozen like everything else in this place. I checked my phone again. The time displayed was 5:47 p.m. Same time it had been when I first noticed the tripod, same time it had been for what felt like over an hour of driving. I opened my photo gallery and saw something that made me want to scream. There were thousands of new images, photos I didn't remember taking, all showing Highway 83 from different angles. And in many of them, I could see my car, see myself driving, see images that must have been captured from outside the vehicle, from positions I'd never been in. The photos showed the figures too, showed them much closer than they'd appeared to my eyes. Close enough that I could see they had faces, human faces that I recognized because they were all me. Dozens of versions of myself standing along the highway at regular intervals. And in each photo I could see more cars in the background, other vehicles that looked identical to mine, all driving the same endless loop. I was one of many. This stretch of Highway 83 was collecting photographers, or maybe collecting people in general, trapping them in this impossible straight line that curved back on itself. And all those figures standing at intervals were other victims, other travelers who'd been driving this road when something went wrong with the fabric of space itself. My fuel gauge hit empty and the low fuel warning came on. I'd burned through an entire tank of gas driving the same mile over and over, covering hundreds of miles of distance while going nowhere. The engine started to sputter, and I pulled over one last time at mile marker 127. And I sat there trying to think, trying to find some solution, trying to understand the rules of this place so I could break them. That's when I noticed the farmhouse. It was about a half-mile west of the highway, a white two-story building with a red barn next to it. And I knew with absolute certainty it hadn't been there before. I would have noticed it in my photos, would have seen it during my earlier shooting. But now it was there, solid and real, with lights on in the windows despite the sun still hanging frozen in the same position. I had two choices: stay on the highway and wait for my car to die completely, leaving me stranded in this loop forever, or walk toward the farmhouse and hope it represented some kind of exit, some boundary where the normal rules resumed. I chose the farmhouse. The walk took longer than it should have. The building never seemed to get closer no matter how long I walked, always remaining about the same distance away. And behind me, I could hear engines, could hear cars driving past on Highway 83, could hear them approaching and fading, but never quite passing me. When I finally reached the farmhouse, after what felt like an hour of walking, I turned around and saw Highway 83 was now miles away, a thin black line on the horizon, which was impossible given how far I'd walked. The front door of the farmhouse was unlocked. Inside, everything was clean and neat and completely normal, furnished like someone lived there, with family photos on the walls and food in the kitchen. But all the clocks showed 5:47 p.m., and all the photos on the walls showed the same family in front of the same farmhouse, posed identically in each frame. And when I looked closer, I realized the people in the photos were aging from frame to frame, going from young to middle-aged to elderly. But the house behind them never changed. I found a desk in the study with a journal lying open, and the last entry was dated July 19th, 1987, exactly 37 years before my own encounter. The entry described a photographer who'd stopped on Highway 83 to take pictures, who'd gotten trapped in a loop, who'd walked to this farmhouse looking for help. The entry ended mid-sentence, just stopped with no explanation. I'm writing this on the next page of that journal, using a pen I found in the desk drawer, because I don't know if I'm getting out of here and someone needs to know what happened. My phone is dead now, battery drained, despite showing full charge 10 minutes ago. My camera still works, and I'm taking photos, documenting everything, hoping that somehow the images will survive, even if I don't. There's a window in the study that faces east toward Highway 83, and through it I can see the road. Can see cars driving that endless straight line. Can see figures standing at intervals. And I think I can see my own car still parked at mile marker 127. And standing next to it is a figure that might be me, might be another version of me that split off when I decided to walk toward the farmhouse instead of staying with the vehicle. The sun still hasn't moved. It's been 5:47 p.m. for what my watch says is 4 hours now, though my watch might be lying like everything else in this place. I can hear sounds outside, footsteps on the porch, someone trying the door handle, but when I look out the windows, I don't see anyone. Just the wheat field stretching to that unchanging horizon, just Highway 83 with its parade of trapped travelers driving the same mile over and over. Horror, family. If you're driving Highway 83 through Kansas and you stop to take photos near mile marker 127, if you find yourself passing the same marker multiple times despite driving straight, don't stop at the farmhouse, don't leave your vehicle, just close your eyes and keep driving and pray that eventually the loop releases you. Make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears. And if anyone finds this journal, if anyone makes it to this farmhouse and reads these words, know that some of us are still here, still trapped in this golden hour that never ends, still driving that infinite straight road that circles back on itself forever. The GPS died first. That should have been my warning to turn around, to forget the shortcut and stick to the main highway. But I was already 2 hours behind schedule, and the coastal backroads looked faster on the map. I'm a travel writer, been documenting New England for a regional magazine for the past 6 years. And I thought I knew these roads, thought I understood how the Maine coast worked. I was wrong about everything. My name is Raven. I write about hidden gems and off-the-beaten-path destinations, places tourists miss because they're not in the guidebooks. On September 8th, 2024, I found a place that isn't in any guidebook because it shouldn't exist, a lighthouse that appears on no charts, and a keeper who died decades before I was born, but somehow knew exactly what was hunting me through those woods. I'd spent the day photographing lighthouses along Route 1, the coastal highway that winds through every picturesque Maine town from Kittery to Calais. By 8 p.m., I was near Rockland, tired and hungry, when my phone's GPS recalculated my route to the hotel in Camden. Instead of following Route 1 north, it directed me onto a smaller coastal road I'd never heard of, promising to save 20 minutes. The road was paved but narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, and it curved through dense pine forest, broken occasionally by glimpses of the ocean. The sun was setting fast, that quick northern sunset that goes from golden to dark in what feels like minutes, and my headlights were catching the reflective eyes of deer at the forest edge. 10 minutes down this road, my GPS screen flickered and died. Just went completely black despite showing full battery. My phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual this far from town. But when I checked my Maps app, it claimed I was in the middle of the ocean, several miles offshore, which was obviously impossible since I was on a paved road surrounded by trees. I considered turning around, but the road was too narrow, no shoulder to speak of, and I figured I'd find a place to turn around once I reached the next town or intersection. So I kept driving, kept following this unnamed coastal road through increasing darkness. And after another 15 minutes, I started to feel uneasy because I hadn't passed a single house or business or any sign of human habitation. That's when I saw the lighthouse. It appeared suddenly as I came around a curve, standing on a rocky point maybe a quarter mile from the road. The beam was rotating, sweeping across the water and occasionally illuminating the forest. And there were lights on in the keeper's house attached to the tower. I felt relief wash over me, because where there was a lighthouse, there would be people. Someone who could give me directions and help me figure out where I'd gone wrong. I found a dirt track leading from the road toward the lighthouse and took it, my car bouncing over ruts and rocks, branches scraping the sides. The track ended in a small clearing near the lighthouse compound, and I parked and got out, grabbing my phone and flashlight. The air smelled wrong. Salt and decay and something chemical, like bleach mixed with rotting fish. The lighthouse beam swept overhead every 30 seconds, and in those moments of illumination, I could see the keeper's house was old. Really old. With peeling paint and broken windows that didn't match the lights I'd seen from the road. I knocked on the door of the keeper's house, and it swung open under my hand, unlocked. And I called out, asking if anyone was home. No answer, except the sound of waves on rocks and the mechanical grinding of the lighthouse mechanism somewhere above. I stepped inside, using my flashlight to illuminate a small entryway that led to a kitchen. The interior looked like it hadn't been occupied in decades. Dust thick on every surface, furniture covered with sheets, old-fashioned kerosene lamps on the tables. But the lights were on. I could see electrical fixtures glowing on the walls, which made no sense given the state of abandonment. "You need to leave." The voice came from behind me, and I spun around. My flashlight beam catching an old man standing in the doorway I'd just come through. He was wearing a keeper's uniform from what looked like the 1950s or earlier. Dark wool with brass buttons, and his face was weathered and stern and impossible to read in the flashlight beam. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I'm lost. My GPS died. I just need directions back to Route 1. "There's no time for directions." He moved closer, and I could see his eyes now, pale blue and urgent. They wake up when cars pass by. The engine sounds, the lights. It draws them up from the deep places in the forest. You parked here. You sat still long enough for them to triangulate your position. And they're coming now. My skin went cold despite his words, making no logical sense. "Who's coming?" "What are you talking about?" "The things that live in the old growth." He grabbed my arm, and his hand was solid, real, warm with body heat. "The trees here are older than the lighthouse, older than the state, older than white settlement in this hemisphere. There are things that grew with those trees, things that learned to hunt by vibration and sound, and the electromagnetic signatures of metal and engines. This lighthouse was built as a warning, not for ships, but for travelers on the coast road. But they decommissioned it, tore down the road signs, erased it from the maps, and now people like you wander in here and don't understand the danger until it's too late." I pulled my arm free, back toward the door. "You're insane. I'm leaving." "Look at your car." I turned and looked through the open door toward where I'd parked. My breath caught in my throat. There were shapes moving around my vehicle, tall shapes that were too thin to be human, moving with a fluid grace that suggested too many joints or joints that bent in wrong directions. They were touching the car, running appendages along the paint, and wherever they touched, the metal seemed to corrode, seemed to rust and bubble and flake away. "They mark vehicles first," the lighthouse keeper said quietly behind me. "Mark them with a kind of enzymatic compound that breaks down metal and glass. In a few hours, your car will be gone, dissolved, and they'll wait in the clearing for you to come back. And when you do, they'll mark you too, and you'll dissolve just as surely as the car, breaking down into component elements they can absorb." I watched in horror as more shapes emerged from the forest. Dozens of them, all converging on my car, and I could hear sounds now, clicking and scraping sounds that reminded me of insect legs, but much louder, much closer. One of the shapes moved into the beam of my car's headlights, and I saw it clearly for maybe 2 seconds before my brain tried to reject what my eyes were reporting. It was vaguely humanoid, but stretched vertically, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, with limbs that branched like trees and a torso covered in something that looked like bark but moved like skin. Where its head should be, there was a cluster of reflective surfaces, eyes maybe, or sensor organs, arranged in a spiral pattern that hurt to look at. And its hands, if they were hands, had too many fingers, dozens of thin protrusions that writhed independently, like the tentacles of a sea anemone. "What are they?" I whispered, unable to look away. "We don't have a name for them in English. The Wabanaki tribes called them the tree walkers. But that's not quite right either. They're old, Raven. Older than human language. They've been in these forests since the ice retreated, maybe longer. And they've learned that humans bring vehicles, bring metal and glass, bring processed materials that their forest doesn't naturally produce. And they've developed a taste for those things. And sometimes, when they're still hungry after consuming the vehicle, they consume the driver too." "How do you know my name?" I turned to face him, the terror momentarily overridden by the impossibility of this stranger knowing who I was. "Because I've been warning people for 73 years, ever since I died in the keeper's house during the hurricane of 1951. The lighthouse saved me, preserved me somehow, kept my consciousness bound to this place so I could warn travelers who stumble onto this forgotten road. You're not the first, Raven. You won't be the last. But you can be one of the survivors if you listen to me right now." I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted this to be a nightmare I could wake up from. But the clicking sounds from the clearing were getting louder, more agitated. And I could see more shapes emerging from the forest, dozens becoming hundreds, all drawn by the presence of my vehicle and my scent. "The marks they put on your car, are they on me?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded slowly. "They marked you when you got out, when you walked from your vehicle to this house. It's in your hair, on your clothes, soaked into your skin. You can smell it if you know what to look for. That chemical scent you noticed when you arrived, that's their marking compound, and it's already starting to work on your cellular structure." My legs nearly gave out. "I'm going to die. You're telling me I'm going to dissolve like my car." "No." His voice was firm, authoritative. "You're going to survive because I'm going to tell you how. The marking compound only works in their territory, within the range of the old-growth forest. If you can get beyond the territorial boundary, beyond the last of the ancient trees, the compound becomes inert. It'll wash off, break down naturally, become harmless. But you have to get there before it reaches critical concentration, which you have maybe 2 hours to do. But my car is gone. You can't go back out there, they're waiting for you. There's another way off this peninsula. An old smuggler's path that runs along the coast and connects to Route 1 about 3 miles north. It's rough terrain, rocky shoreline. But the tree walkers don't like the salt water, don't like open spaces where they can be seen clearly. If you follow the shore north, move fast and don't stop. You'll reach the boundary before the marking compound kills you." He turned and walked to a desk in the corner, pulled out an old storm lantern and lit it with a wooden match, the flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Take this. Don't use your flashlight. The batteries will attract them. Fire they understand, fire they fear. But electrical light they find fascinating." I took the lantern with shaking hands. "Why are you helping me? If you're a ghost, if you've been dead for 70 years, why do you care?" "Because I failed to save my wife." His voice cracked with emotion that had been preserved for 7 decades. She was with me during the hurricane. She was here when I died, and I couldn't warn her about the tree walkers. They found her 3 days after the storm when she tried to hike out for help. I've been here ever since, hoping to save others, hoping that eventually the numbers of people I save will somehow balance the scale of the one person I couldn't. I heard glass breaking from the direction of my car, heard metal groaning as it collapsed in on itself, and the clicking sounds became a chorus, became a celebration of consumption, and I knew I was out of time. The lighthouse keeper led me to a back door I hadn't noticed, opened it to reveal a narrow path leading down toward the rocky shoreline. Follow the coast north. When you see the lobster buoys with the red and white stripes, you'll be close to the boundary. When you see a dock with a green light at the end, you're safe. Run, Raven. Run and don't look back. And when you get to safety, tell people about this place. Tell them to avoid the coastal backroads near Rockland. Tell them if their GPS dies and reroutes them, they should turn around immediately. Tell them about the lighthouse that isn't on any map, and the trees that walk, and the keeper who's been dead for 73 years but still keeps his light burning as a warning. I ran. The storm lantern swung in my hand, casting wild shadows on the rocks. And I could hear things moving in the forest, paralleling my course, could hear that awful clicking following me through the darkness. My lungs burned and my legs ached, and the chemical smell seemed to be getting stronger, seemed to be coming from inside me now. And I knew the marking compound was working, was breaking down my cellular structure, was turning me into something those things could consume. The coast seemed endless. Rocky shore stretching into darkness, ahead and behind, waves crashing against cliffs that I had to climb over and around. And twice I nearly fell, nearly dropped the lantern, nearly ended everything on the rocks. But I kept moving, kept running. And after what felt like hours but was probably 40 minutes, I saw them. Red and white striped lobster buoys bobbing in the water offshore, and I wanted to cry with relief. The green light appeared 10 minutes later, a dock jutting into the water with a solar-powered light at the end. And beyond it, I could see houses, could see cars parked in driveways, could see the normal world that I'd left behind when my GPS had died. I staggered onto that dock and collapsed, my whole body shaking. And the chemical smell started to fade, started to dissipate in the salt air. And I knew I'd made it, knew I'd crossed the boundary with maybe minutes to spare. I walked into town, found a hotel, checked in without luggage or explanation, and I slept for 16 hours straight. When I woke up, my clothes were covered in residue, a white powdery substance that looked like dried salt but dissolved when I touched it. And my hair had a patch that had turned completely white, bleached colorless by whatever the tree walkers had marked me with. I reported my car stolen, told the police it was taken from a parking lot in Rockland. And I never mentioned the lighthouse or the back road or what I'd encountered because I knew how insane it would sound. But I did research, spent weeks in libraries and historical societies, and I found references to that lighthouse, found photos from the early 1900s, found the name of the last keeper, Robert McIntyre, who died during the hurricane of September 12, 1951. Along with his wife Margaret, who was found 3 miles from the lighthouse on September 15th. Her body described in reports as badly decomposed, almost unidentifiable, despite only 3 days having passed. Horror family. If you're driving the Maine coast and your GPS malfunctions, if you find yourself on a narrow coastal road that doesn't match any maps, turn around immediately. Don't investigate lighthouses that aren't supposed to be there. Don't park in forest clearings near ancient trees. And if you smell that chemical scent, that mix of bleach and decay, run for the coast and don't stop until you see those red and white lobster buoys. Subscribe to Verified Fears and drop your own coastal encounters in the comments. Because the tree walkers are still hunting, still marking vehicles and dissolving anything that carries the scent of processed materials. And the lighthouse keeper is still warning anyone who'll listen. This video has taken you through 11 of the most disturbing encounters on America's haunted back roads. If you made it this far, you're part of the horror family now. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to know that the roads they drive might be hiding things that were never meant to be disturbed.